Chapter 649. Caring Old Brother 1. The imperial hunting grounds were surrounded by beautiful scenery, with mountains, waters, and forests. Since Chu Lian was injured, the emperor allowed her to stay in her tent to rest. She didn't need to participate in any activities. Those who were injured were probably the idlest within the entire camp. Wenqing had informed her that, while she was still sleeping, some people had come to check on her situation, such as Old Duke Zheng, Sima Hui, and Captain Guo. Sima Hui had also left behind a maidservant who was skilled in medicine. Chu Lian walked to the lakeside nearby with Wenqing's support. There was something that she couldn't understand. Why was her husband, He Changdi, whom she needed the most, still missing? Even people like Sima Hui, Captain Guo, and Xiao Hongyu had come to express their concern when they found out about her accident. She took a deep breath of the refreshingly cool spring air to suppress the resentment in her heart. If the emperor hadn't made arrangements for the officials who came, then she really wanted to rush to He Changdi and ask about his current thoughts. She was seriously frustrated right now. Even if he was dissatisfied with her, they still had to meet each other to make things clear. What was he trying to do by avoiding her? Chu Lian turned around and instructed Wanlan, "Go inquire about Imperial Princess Leo's situation. Also, check if my husband is over at her side." Just as Chu Lian finished speaking, she heard the sound of a woman's voice. Chu Lian turned around and looked towards the direction of that voice. She saw them at the lakeside about 50 to 60 meters away. A man in a black robe with an icy face and a sword strapped at his waist was walking beside a young girl sitting in a wooden wheelchair. There were 5 maidservant and court attendants behind the young girl. Who else could they be other than He Changdi and Imperial Princess Liao? Chu Lian's clear eyes narrowed slightly. She stared at He Changdi and Imperial Princess Liao, who were currently taking a stroll beside the lake. Her mouth tilted upwards into a mocking smirk. The inner radiance on her beautiful face dimmed slightly. So it turned out that He Changdi had been avoiding her because he was accompanying the injured Imperial Princess Liao. Well, she really learned something from that. Wenqing and Wanlan, who were standing behind Chu Lian, also frowned when they saw the scene in front of them. They couldn't understand what third young master was doing right now. When Hattie became so close with Imperial Princess Liao, He Changdi had a cold expression on his face. With narrowed eyes and a bottomless gaze, it was hard to tell what he was thinking about. When looking carefully, he seemed to have 2 dark smudges under his eyes. He suddenly sensed a familiar gaze on him. The moment he raised his head to look, he met with Chu Lian's astounded gaze. He Changdi's eyebrows instantly furrowed, and a flash of pain appeared within his eyes when he looked at Chu Lian. He leaned forward slightly, wanting to run over to her immediately, but he suddenly thought of something and stopped himself from moving. He took in a deep breath and suppressed the raging impulse within himself. Then, he turned his eyes away coldly. Out of the corner of Chu Lian's eyes, she could see Imperial Princess Liao revealing a jeering and proud smile. Chu Lian controlled her emotions and forced out a faint smile. She bobbed a greeting toward Imperial Princess Liao from afar, then resolutely turned around and left without looking back again. Wenqing and Wanlan, who were following behind Chu Lian, were also infuriated. They positioned themselves on either side of Chu Lian, so they completely blocked Chu Lian's figure, making sure that the people behind them couldn't see her at all. When Chu Lian returned to the tent, she went back into the bed to sulk. She had originally wanted to go out to get some fresh air, but she hadn't expected that it would make her feel even more frustrated instead. Damn it, He Changdi was seriously so toxic. Shortly afterwards, Wenqing reported the information that she had found regarding Imperial Princess Leo's situation. When she mentioned Imperial Princess Leo's injury, Chu Lian didn't feel any sympathy for her at all. There was even a faint sense of delight within her heart. Imperial Princess Liao had been hostile towards her since the first time she entered the palace. Her hostility had become even more obvious nowadays. She still didn't understand He Changdi's intentions. Although Imperial Princess Liao was still very young, her intentions were clear. Did He Sanling really want to become the emperor's son-in-law and marry a princess? The Great Wu dynasty wasn't the same as the previous dynasty. A prince's husband wouldn't be given any actual power. If he married the emperor's daughter, then he would just become an idle plaything waiting for death. Chu Lian's mind was in a jumbled mess. The hunting ground was located in the outskirts of the capital. The weather lagged slightly behind the capital. It was still pretty cold at night. She had ridden all the way here, then suffered a fright yesterday. Thus, she hadn't gotten a good night's rest last night. Chu Lian had obviously become thinner. She looked pale and haggard now. It seemed like all the previous nourishing for her body had been for naught. Wenlin's heart seriously ached. She and her sister knew some martial arts, so they would usually be responsible for taking care of Chu Lian when she goes out. However, Xian was definitely the maidservant whom third young madam trusted the most within the estate. The night before they had departed, Xian had specially told them to take good care of third young madam's health. Senior servant Zhong had also left some words for them in particular. After all, third young madam's health had become better, and the young couple had a loving relationship. It was entirely possible that there was already a young heir in her belly. Well, look at what happened now. Not only third young madam had not gained any weight, but she had even become thinner than before. I've been running around for the whole morning, and I haven't even had a sip of water. Wenqing sneered. What? The snacks over at Imperial Princess Liao's place wasn't enough to fill your stomach? Stop pretending to be so pitiful in front of me. Liua felt pity for himself inwardly. Sister Wenqing, please don't misunderstand me. I went out for an errand early this morning. I never went to Imperial Princess Liao's side. Wenqing was stunned. You didn't go to Imperial Princess Liao's tent? Liua shook his head and his face was scrunched up like an orange. So only third young master went? I'm not sure about that. That's not something I would dare ask third young master about. Wenqing gave him a fierce glare. You're so useless. No. Sister, I'm really innocent. Please spare me some food. Liua really did look quite pitiful. There were stains all over his green robe and stubble had grown on his chin. His hair was also in a mess. Just by looking at his appearance, he really looked like a random refugee. Wenqing harumphed. Come with me. Third young madam has some leftovers from lunch. You got lucky. Liua smiled, flashing a mouthful of white teeth. All right. It's fine as long as there's something to eat. I don't mind. The hungry He Changdi, who wasn't even in the mood to eat, would never have thought that his personal manservant had already abandoned him. Each household was to take care of their own food and needs on the hunting grounds, as the imperial family wouldn't care about their survival. Even if He Changdi was on duty every day, he still needed to have his meals in his own tent. Chu Lian had purposely eaten earlier to avoid having to sit at the same table as He Changdi. However, she didn't expect Wenqing and Wan Lan to be even more harsh. They hadn't even prepared any food for He Changdi. Regardless, He Changdi didn't have any appetite right now. His head and heart were in a complete daze. He tiptoed around the screen to check on Chu Lian. Chu Lian was laying on her side with her back facing him. Her soft little body was curled up into a ball. He reached out, about to touch her, but he retracted his hand halfway through. He closed his eyes, then walked around the screen and laid down on the chaise beside it for a while. Chu Lian opened her eyes once he left. Chu Lian stared at the ceiling and blinked furiously. She hadn't actually fallen asleep just now. After a long moment, she smiled at herself mockingly. It seemed like it would be impossible to get an explanation from He Changdi. Forget it. If he didn't want to speak, then so be it. Chu Lian angrily turned over, closed her eyes, and fell asleep for real. He Changdi wasn't in the tent anymore when she woke up. In the afternoon, the emperor took his men to the forest in the mountain to hunt. Royal Princess Duanjia sent someone to bring over some wild meat, including wild duck, pheasant, and a deer. There was supposed to be a bonfire banquet tonight, but Chu Lian used her ill health as an excuse to decline attendance. However, Chu Lian felt bad for not doing anything at all when facing the game that had been sent over. Wenqing brought a rocking chair over for her. She sat on the chair and directed the maidservants on how to roast the game. After they finished preparing the wild meats, Chu Lian didn't even take a bite. She ordered people to send them to Old Duke Zheng, Royal Princess Duanjia, Prince Jin, and the others. Chapter 651. Caring Old Brother 3. There were still 2 hours before tonight's bonfire banquet. He Changdi was sulking while sitting inside Prince Jin's tent. Although his handsome face was as cold as ever, but it was also very pale and haggard. Prince Jean lifted the tent flap and saw his good friend was sitting beside the table in a daze. He glanced at him calmly with his blue eyes. "What's wrong? Why do you look so lifeless?" He Chang's thin lips were tightly pursed and his eyes were lowered, as if he was a statue that couldn't speak. Prince Jean took off his cloak and handed it to the attendant beside him. After that, he walked towards Changdi and carefully examined him from head to toe a couple of times. His clothes were disheveled. He appeared haggard and miserable. He had an unkempt beard and bloodshot eyes with dark shadows under them. SK. What in the world had happened to this guy? As soon as Prince Jean sat down, a maidservant brought over a warming soup. He hadn't even lifted his spoon when Changdi gloomily said, "Give me a bowl, too." Prince Jean was stunned now. He held the spoon and looked at his close friend with furrowed brows. "With the meals that Jeannie cooks, you still want the food prepared here?" When Gillen restaurant had still been open, he would go to the restaurant to satisfy his cravings. Even a dignified prince had to visit a restaurant in order to satisfy his appetite. On the other hand, Changdi was actually going around outside to eat other people's crudely made food. What a joke. Sanlang was indifferent to Prince Jean's teasing and said faintly, "I haven't eaten anything for a whole day and night." Prince Jean. Would Jeannie starve you? That girl was a foodie. She was probably stuffing her face whenever she was free. There was no way she didn't prepare any food. Even if she didn't make it herself, she still had 2 maidservants who had learned some of her skills beside her. No matter what, Changdi wouldn't be starved. Sanlang didn't say anything and remained silent. When the maidservant brought another bowl of soup over, he held it up and finished it in one breath. He wasn't tasting the food at all and was just simply trying to fill his stomach. Prince Jean was somewhat dumbfounded and shook his head helplessly. "I wanted you to taste it properly. Although the soup isn't as delicious as the foods that Jeannie makes, it's still considered a delicacy." While Prince Jean was drinking his soup, his attendant came in to make a report. Reporting to 4th Prince, Honored Lady Jeannie sent over some wild game. Would you like to try some right now? Prince Jean was stunned and raised his brows. Look at that. The moment he mentioned Chulian, she had sent over some food for him to eat. Bring them in. The attendant hastily went out. A moment later, he came in with a food box. Then, he took out the 2 plates of meat from the food box and placed them on the table. A plate of venison and a plate of duck meat, which were already sliced up. They had just been roasted, so the roast meat inside the plates was still steaming with heat. The fragrance of the meat billowed up into their faces. Prince Jean picked up his chopsticks and pointed at the 2 plates in front of him. "You've been exposed. Can you still say you didn't eat anything? Jeannie wouldn't have sent all the roasted meats that she prepared over to me, right?" Changdi had a bitter expression on his face because it was true. Chu Lian hadn't left any of her cooking for him to eat. Without hesitation, Sanlang picked up his chopsticks, grabbed a piece of roasted meat, and stuffed it into his mouth. It was crispy and tender, a taste that was unforgettable for a lifetime. It had definitely been roasted with Chu Lian's recipe. However, his mouth was filled with bitterness when eating such delicious delicacies. Prince Jean didn't think his good friend would suddenly start digging into his food. He complained, "Hey, aren't you being too rude? Jeannie sent these for me to eat. If you want to eat, then have Jeannie make some for you. You can eat as much as you want. Why are you taking my share?" Although Prince Jean complained, he didn't stop his friend's action. He knew his friend was in a bad mood. He had only interrupted to distract his friend from his thoughts. The 2 plates of roast meats were soon cleared by these 2 grown men. Prince Jean leaned back against his chair slightly. His gaze fell upon his friend, who was still in a daze. "Say it. What happened? Did you have an argument with Jeannie?" Sanlang rubbed his stiff face and took a deep breath. "Lianer is mad at me." Prince Jean lifted his pair of unique eyes. "Tell me about it." Sanlang and Prince Jean were sworn brothers who had grown up together. Since their previous lifetime, they had been best friends who could risk their lives for each other. Thus, there was nothing they couldn't talk about. After some deliberation, Changdi told him the whole story. Prince Jean was slightly stunned after listening to him. His blue eyes flickered in disbelief. "You wouldn't actually be interested in that brat Liao, right?" He Changdi was dumbfounded by his friend's question. He had a grim expression on his face, and his voice had a sense of anger. Louis, what do you mean? Prince Jean sneered coldly. You embraced her, and you've been accompanying her. Doesn't that mean you're interested in that brat? He Changdi, don't misunderstand. Imperial Princess Liao is only 11 years old. I'm not a pervert. Haha, it was His Majesty's order. I can't reject an imperial order. Prince Jean gave his idiotic friend a glare and scoffed. Are you an idiot? Liao is already 11 years old. Are there any imperial children who are actually naive? Don't tell me that Liao is still young. In another year, she is going to be 12. Even for noble families, marriage arrangements can begin when they're 12. Liao is resentful towards Genie. Haven't you ever considered Jinyi's feelings? In my opinion, you're probably worse than Xiao Bojian. Prince Jean's last comment was somewhat harsh, but when facing someone so oblivious, he had to knock him awake somehow. TL note, food porn after a long time. I love roasted duck, that crispy, fatty skin and the soft, tender meat inside. Drools roasted venison, roasted duck. Chapter 652. Caring Old Brother, 4. When He Changdi finally understood Prince Jean's words, he instantly felt enlightened. His expression suddenly became grave, while he felt guilty and terrified inwardly. He clenched his fist and finally restrained his erupting emotions. He asked in a cold voice, how's the investigation going? A dangerous glint instantly emerged within Prince Jean's previously jeering and teasing gaze. Both Leo's injury and Jinyi's fall from the horse were prearranged, but I haven't been able to track down the real mastermind. I can't be certain that the mastermind is sixth brother. A dangerous and icy glint flashed through He Changdi's deep gaze. Prince Jean tapped on the round table with one of his slender fingers. However, there's something I don't understand. I can understand them scheming against you, but why are they also harming Genie? Even if Xiao Bojian still has lingering feelings for Chulian, he didn't need to risk his life. Moreover, he did it in front of father. This was indeed a mystery. During this lifetime, Chulian didn't have any relationship with Xiao Bojian at all. Furthermore, she had nothing to do with all the fighting and scheming for power. However, she had been unknowingly implicated into this struggle for power. Even He Changdi, who was a reincarnator, couldn't figure this out. What do you think? He Sanling shook his head. You don't have to worry. He'll protect Lianer. Prince Jean didn't continue speaking. They remained silent for a while before Prince Jean began telling him to leave. All right, hurry up and leave. I have to rest. I can't sleep while looking at your ice block face. He Changdi stood up and left with a frosty expression. There was still an hour before the bonfire banquet that the Emperor is hosting. He wanted to go back to check on Chulian, but he still felt somewhat awkward about the situation. He Sanling looked around, then turned and walked towards Captain Gua and Zhang Mei's tent. Captain Gua's wife was completely unrelated to the imperial family, so he had come to the spring hunt alone this time and stayed in the same tent as Zhang Mei. He walked up to the tent and looked at the familiar curtain. He remembered the time he had spent at the northern border with his brothers in the military. He Changdi's stiff expression slightly loosened up. The soldier at the entrance recognized He Changdi, so he immediately went in to report his arrival after giving him a salute. A moment later, the soldier lifted the curtain and he strode inside. Captain Gua and Zhang Mei were sitting around a small table while drinking wine and eating roasted meat. They were spending their days quite leisurely. When Captain Gua saw that it was He Changdi, he quickly waved at him. Zixiang, come and sit down. He Changdi strode towards the small table and sat on the floor together with them. A woolen carpet was spread out on the floor of the tent, so it wasn't cold. He Changdi narrowed his eyes as he thought with a stiff expression, she's ignoring him, not cooking for him, and not speaking to him. Captain Gua became even more enthusiastic as he listened. They're a young couple, so it's normal to have a few quarrels. And it's typical for women to be slightly unreasonable. She might already be regretting it, but she's too thin-skinned and embarrassed to say anything. Right, a man should be thick-skinned. You need to take the initiative to apologize to her, then sway her with some sweet words. He Changdi frowned. He clearly had doubts with Captain Gua and Zhang Mei's suggestions. In his heart, Chu Lian wasn't a woman who liked to make a fuss without reason. Captain Gua noticed that there was still some suspicion on his face, so he gritted his teeth and revealed his ultimate trick. Listen to this, old brother. If that still doesn't solve the problem, then work it out in bed. If one time doesn't work, then do it twice. Anyways, this trick is especially effective with your sister-in-law. Chapter 653, Hot Springs, 1. Hichangdi. Captain Gua roughly patted Hichangdi's ramrod straight back and tried to encourage him. That's just how marriage works. Look, I've been together with my wife for so many years, and we've even had this many kids, yet our relationship is stronger than ever. Listen to me. ITLL work. These two old bastards were going overboard with their advice, so Sailing quickly stopped them. He said, "All right, it's getting late. You should return to the area, brothers." Before leaving, Captain Gua and Zhang Mai reminded Hichangdi to pass on their advice to his so-called subordinate. Hichangdi's mouth twitched. Captain Gua and Zhang Mai were clearly doing that on purpose. The story about his subordinate was just a pretense, and everything referred to Hichangdi himself. Chu Lian didn't attend the bonfire banquet. While those at the banquet were feasting, gambling, and partying, she had already gone to bed alone. Perhaps due to the many mishaps during this spring hunt, the original schedule had been considerably shortened. The Emperor's decree had already been passed down that afternoon. They would head back to the capital the next morning instead of staying an extra day as previously planned. On the way back, they would only make a stop at the imperial residence in Shangjing for a night, and everyone who participated in the hunt this time would be rewarded with a trip to the hot springs. Perhaps due to the fact that they were leaving the next day, the bonfire banquet was more lively than usual, but this was no longer of any concern to Chu Lian. It was only at midnight that the Emperor dismissed the banquet. Hichangdi returned past midnight. He again went behind the screen to peek at Chu Lian before going to rest on the chaise outside. The next day, it took until late morning for the spring hunt party to prepare to leave. The imperial residence in Shangjing was only a short journey away, so there was no hurry. As Hichangdi was considered a military official, he had to guard the emperor alongside the left military guards and the Yulin army. Therefore, he had been called away by He Lin's messenger early in the morning. Chu Lian hadn't seen him since she woke up. The last time she had spoken to him was when he had followed the emperor to the hunting grounds, so they hadn't spoken to each other for 2 whole days. Wenqing saw the dull expression on third young madam's face and sighed inwardly. She asked, "Third young madam, everything has been packed. Shall we set off?" Chu Lian scrubbed her cheeks and forced a smile. When she stood up, she had a dizzy spell and felt as if the world was spinning. Wenqing was startled by this. She hastily caught hold of Chu Lian and asked, visibly anxious, "Third young madam, are you all right?" "Woozy," Chu Lian replied softly. Wenqing helped her back to her seat. Once she sat down, the dizziness subsided. Wenqing stroked her back soothingly. "Third young madam, shall I call for the female imperial physician?" The imperial physician that Sima Hui had sent to check on Chu Lian's well-being had just been sent back this morning. If Wenqing and Wanlan had known that Chu Lian wasn't feeling well, they wouldn't have sent the physician back. Chu Lian wasn't the type to stubbornly refuse treatment, so she waved her hand to tell Wenqing to get the physician. However, before Wenqing could leave the tent, there was news from the Yulin army to set off. The Yulin army's words were basically the same as an imperial edict. No one could disobey. Helpless, Wenqing turned back and informed Chu Lian of this. Chu Lian had no choice but to endure it for now. Luckily, the emperor had given permission for several injured members to travel back by carriage this time. This list included Chu Lian, Princess Liao, and Xiao Bojian. Enduring the dizzy feeling, Chu Lian had Wenqing and Wanlan support her onto the carriage. Once Chu Lian had settled down, Wenqing wanted to look for the female physician, but was stopped by Chu Lian. "The journey is pretty short. It can wait until we reach the imperial villa at Shangjing." The imperial physicians who came on the hunt had to ride on horses. They also had to pack their tools and medicines, so they were much busier than them. Wanlan covered Chu Lian's knees with a soft blanket, worry in her eyes as she asked, "Third young madam, will you be able to last till then?" Chu Lian smiled. "I'm already feeling a lot better. There shouldn't be a problem unless I stand for too long. Perhaps this happened because I ate too little over the last 2 days." "Do we have any snacks? Bring me some." Wenqing quickly opened an exquisite, fragrant rosewood box and took out several intricately designed white porcelain plates from it. This servant expected third young madam to get hungry along the way. "So this servant prepared your favorites, third young madam." The snacks displayed on the beautiful porcelain plates were shredded beef jerky, special dried anchovies, candied kumquats, and preserved peaches. Wanlan poured a cup of warm honey water from a silver pot and served it to Chu Lian. Chu Lian received it and took a sip, then glanced at the snacks placed on the table. In the end, she picked the slightly sour candied kumquats and preserved peaches. With the warm honey water filling her tummy and something delicious in her mouth, Chu Lian felt a lot better. Wanlan watched as Chu Lian ate the candied kumquats and preserved peaches and found it strange. The dried anchovies were usually third young madam's favorite. She could eat an entire dish without getting sick of it. Why wasn't she touching them at all today? However, she didn't voice her thoughts. She just silently watched as Chu Lian finished eating and stowed away the remaining snacks. The carriages that the emperor had sent specially for the injured were incredibly comfortable. Although they weren't big, they were lined with thick, soft carpets. The wooden walls of the carriage had also been covered with a soft fabric, along with the relaxing incense inside. It was so comfortable that people could fall asleep easily. Halfway through, Changdi took great efforts to have someone swap shifts with him so that he could go over to the carriage. He wanted to speak with Chu Lian, but when he approached Wenqing and Wanlan, he learned that Chu Lian was asleep. Since his wife was asleep, he couldn't just rouse her for this. Chu Lian seemed to be taking naps very often over the past 2 days, which Sanlang found strange. He wondered if she was really that tired, or if she was just avoiding him. With a thread of helplessness and disappointment, Changdi continued riding his horse next to the carriage with a frosty expression, guarding Chu Lian's carriage for 30 minutes. TL note: surprise food porn, dried beef jerky, dried anchovies, candied kumquats, preserved peaches. Chapter 654, Hot Springs 2. As expected, the imperial residence in Shangjing wasn't far at all. They had departed in the morning, and they arrived in the middle of the afternoon. The attendants of the imperial residence had already received notification some time ago. They were aware that the emperor would bring the rest of the imperial family and officials from the spring hunt over to rest, so they had already arranged rooms for everyone on the list. Their dwellings were distributed according to their ranks. Marquis on Yuan was a second-rank title, so the temporary courtyard they were assigned to would obviously be fitting of that title. The neighboring courtyards were for Lord Yang and Marquis Dingyuan. Once Chu Lian had settled down, Wenqing immediately set off to get the imperial physician. Chu Lian laid down on the bed, leaving only her left wrist free and uncovered. Physician Li gently grabbed her wrist and put 2 fingers on her pulse, spending quite some time to measure it. Physician Li thought for a bit, then took the pulse on Chu Lian's right wrist as well. Physician Li's brows drew together as she finally put down Chu Lian's wrist and sunk into deep thought. Wenqing became impatient from looking at the physician's expression. She asked, "Physician Li, how is our young madam?" After much deliberation, Physician Li found the pulse too light to make a decisive diagnosis, so she gave a safer answer instead. Honored lady has been overly anxious over the past 2 days, and along with the shock she's received, she has a lack of both qi and blood now. There isn't any sickness in her body. All she needs is more nutrition to recover. Chu Lian felt silly now, so she was only feeling weak because of low blood sugar. Relief washed over Wenqing and Wanlan as they heard Physician Li's words. A sliver of a smile finally appeared on Wenqing's face. "Sorry for troubling you, Physician Li." Physician Li waved her hand in protest. "This is part of my duty. Honored lady, since you've come to Shangjing, perhaps you could consider going for a soak in the imperial residence's hot springs?" Chu Lian nodded with a smile, then had Wenqing see Physician Li out. The fact that Chu Lian had sent for the imperial physician naturally couldn't be kept away from Changdi. Changdi once again strove to get some time away from his duties with the emperor and rushed to the courtyard Chu Lian was at. Physician Li had already returned to the area where the other imperial physicians were resting. The physician who had come along for the spring hunt this time was the Imperial Physician Institute's Imperial Physician Sunday. Imperial Physician's son was in his 50s, and his family had all come from medical backgrounds. Currently, other than the director of the institute, he possessed the highest official position and status in the Imperial Physician Institute. He had great medical expertise and had ample experience. Although he wasn't a match for the legendary great Dr. Miao, he was still a well-known physician. The field that Imperial Physician's son specialized in wasn't pediatrics, nor external or internal injuries. It was gynecology. He possessed the lauded title of the godly gynecologist. Physician Li was a female physician of great skill in the palace. She had also received pointers from Imperial Physician Sunday. Once she met up with Imperial Physician's son, she described Chu Lian's pulse in detail to him. "Uncle son, Honored Lady Jeannie seems to have a slippery pulse. Do you think Honored Lady Jeannie is pregnant?" Physician Li couldn't confirm if this was the case, so she had chosen not to mention this to them earlier. Imperial Physician's son stopped what he was doing and stroked his white beard. "From what you described, there's a 70% chance that she's actually pregnant, but it could also be a symptom of her weakened body. You made the right choice with your diagnosis. As physicians of the Imperial Physician Institute, we shouldn't make rash claims without certainty. Even if Honored Lady Jeannie is pregnant, this isn't a good time to diagnose her condition. Just wait a few days, and we'll be able to confirm it." Physician Li nodded. She very much agreed with Imperial Physician's son's view. It was better to speak cautiously when treating royalty. If she claimed that Chu Lian was pregnant, everyone might become overjoyed. But if it turned out to be a mistake, the consequences would be terrible for her. It was always better to take the safe route for an imperial physician. Marquis An Yuan wasn't someone she could provoke, with his lofty position. Furthermore, Honored Lady Jeannie was on good terms with a personage like Princess Wei. Thus, due to a combination of many factors, Chu Lian's pregnancy was temporarily kept a secret. When He Changdi hurried over, Physician Li was already long gone. There were only a couple of unfamiliar servants outside the room, who were maids of the imperial residence. Wenqing and Wanlan were both inside the room. Liwei stayed outside as He Changdi walked in. His sharp eyes swept around the room, but all he saw was Wenqing and Wanlan, who were cleaning up. "Where's your young madam?" He Changdi frowned and asked. Wenqing and Wanlan were feeling rather unhappy with He Changdi, but they didn't dare to show any disrespect to him. The two sisters bowed their heads and answered, "Third young madam has gone to the back to soak in the hot springs." He Changdi paused, then took off his cloak and handed it to Wenqing. He walked 2 steps over to a table and sat down. His voice was akin to frosty winds in their ears as he asked, "What happened? Why did you call for the female physician?" Wenqing reported every detail of the matter of Chu Lian feeling unwell to He Changdi. "And what did Physician Li say?" "Her diagnosis was that third young madam has suffered from too much worry and lacks qi and blood. Third young madam requires more nutrition to recover." With his memories of his previous life, He Changdi had no faith in the physicians from the palace, be they imperial or lady. He was worried about Chu Lian's well-being, so he had already concluded that he would have great Dr. Miao give her a checkup once they returned. When did Lianer go in? Wenqing estimated the time. It has been a while, approximately 30 minutes. He Changdi was worried that Chu Lian had lost consciousness from staying too long in the hot springs, so he took off his robe and entered the adjoining bathing hall where the hot springs were. Chapter 655. What a crappy suggestion. 1. As expected of the imperial family's holiday villa, they were not only situated at the mouth of the hot springs itself, the baths in the villa were extremely luxurious. This villa had been built in the previous dynasty with massive amounts of manpower and resources. However, this luxurious palace hadn't been completed for long before the previous dynasty came to an end, leaving the next dynasty to reap this unexpected benefit. He Changdi lifted up the heavy blinds covering the entrance to the bath of the inner hall. Since the hot spring water came from the ground, there was a special sulfurous smell specific to hot springs lingering in the air. That heavy smell was further mixed with incense and flower fragrances, making it hard to breathe. He Changdi kept his footsteps light and silent. As he passed under the last set of blinds at the entrance, the slender figure in the wide oval bathing pool came into view. Chu Lian's nerves had been strung tight these 2 days, thanks to the fall and the situation afterwards. It was a rare chance for her to visit a hot spring, and its waters did not disappoint. The warmth of the hot spring water surrounded her weary body and allowed her to relax completely. She sat at the side of the pool, where there was a specially carved curved platform to sit on. The water went up to her collarbone, leaving her fair, smooth shoulders open to the air. Her long, silky hair had been pinned up by a simple wooden hairpin, leaving 2 locks of hair to frame her lovely face. Those 2 long locks made a wavy trail where they touched the water, giving a touch of flair to the scene. Afraid that she would slip deeper into the pool, Chu Lian was resting her slender arms on the white jade steps behind her, which were covered by a thick carpet. One hand was placed upon the railing of the jade steps, the end of which was carved into the shape of a phoenix's head. The steam billowing up from the pool made her sleepy. She leaned her head on her forearm and shut her eyes as she laid partly on the carpet. This was the beautiful scene that greeted He Changdi when he entered the bathing area. Chu Lian was currently sitting with her back towards him. Half of her fair back was revealed to the open air, while the other half remained hidden under the steamy waters. Her delicate shoulder blades, so similar to butterfly wings and wet from the waters, reflected the dim glow of the lanterns. A few stray locks of hair trailed down from her long, elegant neck. 2 thin arms stretched out over the woolen carpet laid on the white jade steps. Her snow-white skin looked like exquisite porcelain against the dark crimson of the carpet. The Adam's apple on He Changdi's throat dipped as he gulped once. For some reason, Captain Gua and Zhang Mei's words rang through his head once more. His pupils dilated, and his entire body tensed up as his breathing became heavier. Chapter 656. What a crappy suggestion, too, after fighting a cold war for so long. All that was He Sanlang's head was the desire to soothe his longing for Chu Lian. He continued pressing her down with his kisses. He used his tongue to explore her mouth, teasing her and entwining with her soft tongue. Her hot breath on his face, her light pants, they only fanned the flames in his heart. Just as he was immersed in her warmth, he suddenly tasted something strangely bitter. The hands teasing and roving over Chu Lian's body sensed a different kind of tension. He finally opened his eyes, only to be met with Chu Lian's tear-streaked face. The excitement and desire in He Changdi's eyes slowly ebbed away. He hadn't expected Chu Lian to react this way. He quickly let go of the soft and boneless figure in his arms. His voice carried some huskiness and heartache as he asked, "Lianer, what's wrong?" Chu Lian was feeling especially wronged right now. Her almond-shaped eyes reflected both rage and grievance as she glared right at him. He Changdi felt completely helpless in the face of this. He tried to wipe away Chu Lian's tears with one hand. "It's all my fault, Lianer. Please don't cry." The usually cool He Sanlang was terrible at comforting women. As much as he tried, all he could come up with was those 2 phrases. How could the fires raging in Chu Lian's heart be put out by those simple and thoughtless words? Disappointment radiated from her gaze, and she pushed He Changdi away from her body. Of course, He Sanlang wasn't willing to let her go just yet. Chu Lian struggled even harder. In her extreme rage, she landed a slap on He Changdi's face. The crisp sound of that blow echoed in the wide halls of the bath. Chu Lian had put enough strength into her slap that a bright red mark in the shape of her palm quickly surfaced on one half of He Changdi's handsome face. Taking advantage of He Changdi's momentary daze, Chu Lian slipped out of his arms. She quickly climbed out of the pool, snatched up her nightgown off the privacy screen and pulled it on, and ran out of the bathing area barefoot, leaving behind a stunned He Changdi alone in the steaming hot spring pool. After a long moment, He Sanlang broke out of his statue-like pose to look after where Chu Lian had disappeared. He let out a long sigh and let his body crumple against the wall of the pool. He shut his eyes again. In his mind, the image of Chu Lian's angry, aggrieved, tearful and pitiful expression haunted him. Damn it, he really was a scoundrel. He deserved this slap. He Changdi covered his eyes and thought carefully back to all that had happened the past few days. If He Sanlang refused to reflect even at this point, then he would really be brainless. Xiao Bojian's plans, Imperial Princess Leo's little plot, feudal Princess Anmin pushing things alone, as well as Sixth Prince, who was likely to be the mastermind behind this all. All these were easy enough to figure out, but it was only the Emperor's abnormal attention and caring for Chu Lian that left him befuddled. The expression on He Sanlang's face turned even more grave. He had a feeling that there were some secrets he hadn't been able to find out in his previous life, and that those very secrets would somehow implicate him in some way in this life. The moment He Changdi had straightened out his thoughts, the haze over his mind cleared up. When he recalled his earlier actions, He Changdi scrubbed furiously at his face. Damn Captain Gua and Zhang Mai. Their advice wasn't helpful at all. He had to find a chance to take revenge on them. Chu Lian had already left in a fury, so He Changdi didn't have any more desire to soak in the hot springs. He left the pool and changed into a dry set of clothes before leaving the hall. He looked out into the hall, where Chu Lian was nowhere to be found. He Changdi. His icy gaze swept over to the maidservant standing guard nearby, who couldn't help but tremble under his watch. Replying to Third Young Master, Third Young Madam took Winching and Wanlan over to Royal Princess Duangia's. Third Young Madam has informed this servant that she will be staying with Royal Princess Duanjia tonight. Third Young Master doesn't have to wait for her. She asked Third Young Master to sleep earlier. Faced with He Changdi's dangerous gaze, the maidservant finished her report while stuttering. He Changdi didn't say anything in reply. The storm on his face simply turned even darker. He changed into another set of clothes and headed for Prince Weiss Hall. However, he was stopped by Prince Weiss' manservant at the entrance. The manservant smiled kindly. Marquis Anyuan, this servant apologizes greatly for the inconvenience. Their Highnesses have already settled down for the night. If Milord has any business at hand, please wait for the next morning. There were other guards at the entrance and Prince Weiss' status was special. He Changdi couldn't enter by force. He could only stay at the entrance. When the manservant saw that He Changdi still stood there silently with a cold expression, he tried to persuade him. Marquis Anyuan, please rest assured. Her Highness treats honored Lady Jeannie as her own daughter. How could honored lady suffer any bit of mistreatment here with Her Highness? Honored lady will return to you without a single hair missing. It's getting late. Marquis Anyuan should head back to rest. He Changdi continued standing there with his hands behind his back in his black robes, as if the manservant hadn't spoken at all. The manservant had no other way to deal with this stubborn marquis. Well, if that's what you want, this servant won't bother with you. After saying so, the manservant waved at the guards. The crimson gates of the courtyard were quickly shut, leaving He Changdi outside. The remaining two guards outside didn't even glance at He Changdi and stood at their posts with ramrod straight backs, looking like a pair of statues. After a moment, the gates didn't open again and the inside was as quiet as could be. Liyue couldn't bear seeing the situation like this and tried to coax his master. Third Young Master, why don't we head back? Nothing will happen to Third Young Madam here. We still have a long journey to the capital tomorrow, and you still have to accompany the Emperor. He Changdi turned his head slightly to look at Liyue. Following that, he pressed his thin lips together and waved his hand at Liyue, clearly ordering him to return to their hall first. Liyue knew that he hadn't succeeded at all. His Third Young Master was a stubborn one. There was no swaying him at this point. However, as He Changdi's manservant, he couldn't really just head back by himself. He couldn't sit back and relax while his master was suffering. Thus, he resigned himself to his fate and stood in front of Prince Weiss' dwelling with He Changdi. They had only been standing there for an hour when a sudden bolt of lightning and roll of thunder announced the start of a thunderstorm. Heavy rain started pouring in the darkness of the night. Chapter 657. Playing Pitiful 1. Within a side room in the courtyard, Chu Lian was about to lie in bed under Wenqing's careful attendance. She had been feeling tired throughout the day and had even received a surprise assault from He Changdi in the night. Her mind had been on edge the whole day. Now that she finally got to relax, the exhaustion piled up upon her. However, the moment she laid down, there was the sound of thunder, and then came the pattering sound of rain. Chu Lian stared blankly at the ceiling. She blinked her almond-shaped eyes several times, then pulled up the blanket to cover her ears in an attempt to isolate herself from the annoying sound of rainfall. Wenqing stood to one side, contemplating whether to speak or not. She had already received news of third young master coming over and waiting outside the gates. It was evident that Prince and Princess Wei had no intention of keeping He Changdis' actions from Chu Lian. The final say was left to Chu Lian. Even though Wenqing was concerned about the well-being of her master, as a mere servant, it wasn't her place to say anything. Chu Lian reached out and made a gesture for Wenqing to go and said, "You've worked hard today. Go get some rest too." Wenqing sighed inwardly. The quarrel between third young madam and third young master must be really bad this time. Even at this point in their relationship, there were still obstacles between the two of them. This servant will retreat for now. This servant will have a rest on the chaise right outside. Please call for this servant if you need anything. Third young madam. Once Wenqing's footsteps faded away, Chu Lian pulled down the blanket covering her face. As she looked at the peaceful turquoise-colored canopy, her mind was filled with chaotic thoughts. She forced her eyes shut, but the sounds of the pattering rain and cracking thunder pierced her ears and felt like hammers slamming down on her heart. Chu Lian tossed and turned, but she just couldn't fall asleep. All that was on her mind were the words reported by a servant who had come by earlier. "Honored lady, Marquis An Yuan has come over looking for you." The princess ordered the guards to stop him from entering, and the guards have advised him to leave, but it doesn't seem like Marquis An Yuan intends to do so. He has been standing at the entrance for an hour. Do you have any orders? It had never occurred to Chu Lian that it would rain tonight, and that it would be such a heavy downpour. That lunatic He Sanling wouldn't actually be so silly to stand in front of the gate all night, right? At the entrance, there were only small eaves hanging over the door to protect people from the rain. Wouldn't he already be soaked by now? It was already spring, and summer would soon come, but it was still easy to fall ill by staying out in the rain like this. Even though they had great Dr. Miao, the Great Wu dynasty wasn't like the modern times. They didn't have any advanced medical equipment. Thus, even the smallest cold could end up taking a person's life. Chu Lian's thoughts went wild. The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. The maidservant had said that Lai Wei was there as well. That fellow wouldn't just stand there and watch his master get soaked, right? He Sanlang would have to stay by His Majesty's side as a guard the next morning as well. After tossing and turning restlessly in bed for another 15 minutes, Chu Lian couldn't continue lying down anymore. She got up and listened to the pouring rain, praying that it would lighten up, but the heavens paid no heed to her wishes. The rain outside didn't get any softer at all, and was even getting louder instead. Chu Lian finally had enough and shouted for Wenqing, who was resting outside. Wenqing quickly entered. From her attire, it was obvious that she hadn't gone to rest at all. Chu Lian gripped the blanket tightly with both hands, took a deep breath, then ordered, "Wenqing, go to the entrance and check if he has left." Wenqing's eyes brightened up. She quickly answered in the affirmative and bowed to Chu Lian, then immediately walked off to complete the task. Chu Lian watched as Wenqing left impatiently and sighed. They had probably guessed that she would be too soft-hearted to ignore this situation. Oh well, what's done is done. She had never had the heart to watch He Changdi suffer anyway. At the entrance, the originally suave and charismatic He Sanlang was now so soaked that he looked like a drowned rat. The 2 locks of hair framing his face were now stuck to his face due to the rain, and drops of rain were streaking down his stubborn expression and dripping from his chin. He raised one hand to wipe away the rainwater on his face. He maintained a frosty expression in the pouring rain, but his back was straighter than ever. Even the 2 guards couldn't bear to watch him do this to himself. "Marquis, please come over here for cover. The spring rain is chilly, and it will be easy to fall ill if Marquis stays there." He Changdi didn't move an inch. It was as if the 2 guards didn't even exist. The 2 guards were at a loss for what to do, so they secretly had someone report this to the higher-ups. Unexpectedly, the servant who went to pass the message returned and told them to leave Marquis An Yuan alone. As long as Honored Lady Jeannie remained silent, this would be none of their concern even if he stood there overnight. The 2 guards looked at each other and had no choice but to keep their mouths shut. Lai Wei was standing there holding 2 umbrellas and was incredibly anxious as well. He was completely soaked, and he had tried to persuade third young master to take an umbrella or go back for now, but Changdi stayed unmoving like a stone statue. Like a fool, Liyue held the umbrellas without opening them, and accompanied his crazy master in front of the entrance. If it wasn't for the fact that these guards refused to let him enter as well, he would have already gone in to look for third young madam with tears in his eyes. Right as Liyue was falling into a daze, he caught sight of someone in his peripheral vision. It was a familiar figure to him. He abruptly raised his head, and his eyes met with Wenqing's searching gaze. His eyes immediately brightened up, and he waved at Wenqing from outside the courtyard like an idiot. His smile was so wide that it revealed all of his white teeth. Wenqing served third young madam personally. Since she had come here at this time, it had to be by third young madam's order. It seemed like third young master hadn't gotten soaked for nothing. The rainbow comes after the storm. This had truly been an arduous mission. Wenqing glared at him, then shifted her gaze to Changdi. She sized him up, then turned away and left quickly. Liyue moved closer to Changdi and said with a silly smile on his face, "Third young master, did you see who that was?" It was Wenqing. Changdi sent a chilly gaze at him, and Liyue immediately curbed his smile and shut his mouth. Chapter 659. Playing Pitiful 2. Wenqing narrated what she had seen in full detail to Chu Lian. Chu Lian sat by the bed, a little stunned. The dim yellow candle light shone on the side of her face, making her small face seem even paler. As Wenqing didn't hear any reply from Chu Lian, she had to probe again. "Third young madam, what should we do?" Chu Lian sighed softly. "Wenqing, take him to the opposite room, and have Wenlan get him a clean set of clothes." "Okay, I'm going to sleep now. Don't disturb me unless it's for something important." Wenqing felt a burst of joy inside. Although the majority of the blame for the couple's fight fell upon third young master this time, and she wanted to get justice for third young madam as well, the men were still the ones who held power in the Great Wu dynasty. If the relationship between husband and wife deteriorated, Chu Lian would always be on the losing side as the wife. Wenqing personally went out and conveyed Chu Lian's words to third young master. This time, Changdi managed to enter the courtyard smoothly and changed into clean, dry clothes in the room beside Chu Lian's. He wanted to go take a look at Chu Lian, but Wenlan informed him that third young madam had already gone to sleep. On the other side, the lights were still on in Royal Princess Duanjia's room. A maidservant was standing beside her and softly reporting something to her. Once she heard all of it, Royal Princess Duanjia pouted and gestured for the maid to leave. When she was the only one left inside the room, a tall and burly figure appeared from behind a screen. Changjue walked over to the table and sat down. "Third brother and third sister-in-law have always had a good relationship. Why are they suddenly fighting?" Royal Princess Duanjia rolled her eyes without any care for her image. "Honestly, your brother's heart is like a blob of corniness. Getting soaked in the rain? He obviously did that on purpose. That silly Chu Lu would probably let everything go after he coaxes her a little." Changjue awkwardly coughed. "Sanlang isn't as bad as you think. He just really loves his wife." "Bullshit. Who even shows their love for their wife like this? And is he blind or something? He's been so close to that damned brat Liao." Changjue stiffened up as he was unable to refute that. Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly turned her head and glared at Changjue, then pointed her finger right in his face. "If you dare to treat me like this in the future, I'll immediately divorce you." Change's face immediately turned black. The next day, everyone was preparing to return to the capital early in the morning. As Changdi had to stay by the emperor's side as a guard, he had already gotten up before dawn. Before he left, he stood in front of Chu Lian's window for 15 minutes and finally left while suppressing his coughs. When Chu Lian got up, Changdi was already long gone. She endured the urge to ask about Changdi's condition. However, her complexion seemed to have greatly improved after a proper night's rest. Once everything was packed, they boarded the carriage. Only an hour through the journey back to the capital, someone knocked on the window of the carriage. Wenlan raised the curtain of the carriage. Seeing the person outside the carriage, she greeted, "Good morning, General Sima. Have you come to look for our third young madam?" Sima Hui was riding on a snow-white horse. Looking incredibly suave in her martial attire, she nodded towards Wanlan with a smile. A few moments later, Winching and Wanlan stepped off the carriage and got onto horses instead, leaving the space in the carriage for Chulian and Sima Hui. The moment Sima Hui entered the carriage, she looked around the spacious carriage and touched the decor in the carriage. A smile surfaced on her lips as she said, as expected of the imperial family's carriage. If I hadn't known beforehand, I would have thought that the person riding in this carriage was a prince or princess. Chu Lian gave her a look of disdain. This is a carriage granted by the emperor himself. Of course it would be high quality. Sima Hui laughed. That's where you're wrong. The one that Xiao Bojian is riding in isn't as good as this one. Sister Hui, have you come here just to make fun of me? All right, I'll stop joking with you. Seeing Sima Hui's serious expression, Chu Lian set aside the smile on her face. With clear eyes and a slight frown, she asked, What is it? Sima Hui sat right next to her and coughed twice awkwardly. Lianer, just what happened between you and He Sanlang? Chu Lian. Right now, Chu Lian truly wished that she could find a hole and bury her head inside it. Why was it that this insignificant matter between her and her husband was known to everyone around them? After coming to her tent for a free meal on the first day, Sima Hui had stayed by the emperor's side with the other military officials. The two hadn't even seen each other until now, yet Sima Hui had still caught wind of this. The corner of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. Only one possibility came to mind. Was it fourth prince who told you about it? Prince Jean was the lunatic He Changda's best friend. If he needed to confide in someone about this, Prince Jean would be his first choice. Chapter 659. Let me lean on you, 1. Sima Hui smiled and didn't deny it. After spending some time together in the north, Sima Hui had gotten some understanding of Chu Lian's personality. She didn't continue pressing Chu Lian about her relationship with her husband and turned the conversation elsewhere. Lianer, I wasn't trying to pry. I'm just a messenger sent from fourth prince, here to inform you of some facts. Chu Lian turned a confused look on Sima Hui. Facts? When Sima Hui noticed the dazed look on Chu Lian's cute little face, she knew instantly that her silly friend wasn't in the know. She sighed inwardly, cursing at He Changdi in her mind for keeping everything hidden from his wife. That man had suppressed all his bitterness and hatred in his heart. If not for this special situation and Prince Jean's inside knowledge, then this couple's relationship might really have gone beyond the point of repair. The silver mine that He Changdi and Prince Jean have been hiding at the north is being investigated. Chu Lian's eyes widened in disbelief. Was she joking? A silver mine? The discovery of any silver mines had to be reported to the court immediately so that the Ministry of Revenue could make an official report of it to the emperor. The emperor himself would then order the cabinet to pick a few suitable officials to lead a team to develop the mine. The law here was that no one could develop mines on their own, even the princes. He Changdi was way too bold. He actually developed a private mine of his own with Prince Jean. Thinking back to when they were in the north and how He Changda's subordinates had kept disappearing, a chill sprung up in Chu Lian's heart. It was her fault for not reading the story to the end and not finding out if there was anything information related to the silver mine. No wonder he had been so generous with his money that time. He had bought her accessories and even that storefront. When she had asked, all he had said that the money was his and that he had gotten it through legitimate means that had to be kept secret. Well, now she knew exactly what it had to be kept secret. That money had come from the silver in his illegal mine. If the emperor really wanted to pursue the matter, he could definitely mete out a heavy punishment. Taking away his official position as well as his noble rank were all within expectations. Does His Majesty know? A tremor had developed in Chu Lian's voice when she spoke. Sima Hui nodded gravely. His Majesty found out right before the spring hunt. Chu Lian immediately realized how serious the matter was. Her own expression took a turn for the worse. And Imperial concubine Wei knows about this matter as well. Sima Hui calmly added on a bombshell that gave Chu Lian the urge to fall to the ground. Chu Lian couldn't hold back her gasp. But you don't have to worry too much. Prince Jean and Marquis On Yuan have already controlled any news leaking about this matter, and there aren't many who know about it. His Majesty has also quietly given them permission to hand over the silver mine to the court through the proper channels instead. Prince Jean was still the Emperor's flesh and blood after all. Although this incident had turned the Emperor's impression of him towards the negative, the benefits brought to the country by discovering a new silver mine were enough to grant him some merit for the achievement, enough for the Emperor to overlook his mistake. Chu Lian suddenly thought back to the morning she had seen He Changdi accompanying Imperial Princess Liao. Sima Hui seemed to have guessed at her train of thought. Marquis Yuan has been accompanying Princess Liao for the past 2 days, partly because of the Emperor's order, as well as due to Imperial concubine Wei's threats. Imperial Princess Liao got crippled because of her own reckless actions. Unfortunately, because Marquis Yuan was nearby when it happened, Imperial concubine Wei feels that it was Marquis Yuan's fault for not saving her in time. Chu Lian's eyes opened wide. She really couldn't believe what she was hearing. There were so many reasons behind his cold behavior towards her the past few days. Why didn't He Changdi talk to her? When she wanted to open her heart to him, he had kept avoiding her, as if she were some scary beast. Sima Hui noticed that Chu Lian had lowered her head and closed her eyes. Her lips were pressed tightly together. The general knew that her friend had taken her words to heart. "All right, I'm not going to say anything else. The rest is between you and your husband. If you have the time, go and have a good chat with him." Sima Hui stroked Chu Lian's smooth hair before lifting the curtain entrance of the carriage and jumping straight out, landing on her mount smoothly. She wielded her horse whip gracefully, and her horse shot forward to join the rest of the military officials further in front. When the spring hunt party passed the gates of the capital, they each returned to their own estates. Only a few officials still had to follow behind the Emperor and enter the palace for further orders. Chu Lian was intending to wait at Xuanwu Gate for He Changdi so that they could return home together. Unfortunately, Lai Wei came out with a special message from He Changdi, telling her to head home first. Chu Lian thought it over for a moment before shooting a look at Lai Wei, who was waiting respectfully at the side. Instead of instructing the driver or the guards to move, she started questioning He Changdi's manservant. "Where did you go last night?" Lai Wei looked up in shock over the question, but quickly lowered his head again to hide the flash of panic in his eyes. He tried his best to calm down and answered, replying to third young madam, "This servant didn't go anywhere. This servant went to sleep the moment it got dark." The usual soft and watery gaze in Chu Lian's eyes was gone, replaced by a frigid glare that could rival her husband's. When it landed on Lei Yu's frame, he couldn't bear the pressure and started trembling uncontrollably. Lei Yu's head shrunk even lower. Chu Lian didn't continue speaking and simply continued looking at him. Chapter 660. Let me lean on you, too. Finally, Lai Wei broke under the weight of her gaze and spoke the truth. "Third young madam, this servant deserves death for lying to you. However, third young master already gave me an order. Last night, this servant and third young master went into the forest to pick medicinal herbs. It wasn't until midnight that we finally found all the ingredients that Imperial concubine Wei needed." "What?" Chu Lian stared at Lai Wei in shock, her almond-shaped eyes even wider than usual. Lai Wei thought that Chu Lian didn't believe his words. He pleaded with a sincere and put-out tone, "Third young madam, this servant is speaking the truth this time. If this servant lies, then this servant will never—" All right, I heard you. I believe you." Chu Lian cut off his vow and let down the curtain covering the carriage entrance. She settled back into her seat in the carriage. Imperial concubine Wei. Chu Lian was all puffed up with anger. That woman actually dared to bully her man. That lunatic He Changdi. He was clearly just a fool. He was so stupid to actually agree to such a ridiculous demand too. Oh, she was so angry. Although Lai Wei could sense that third young madam was angry, the carriage remained stationary outside of the palace gates. Did this mean that third young madam was going to wait for third young master to be done? Lei perked up. While third young master and madam had been fighting, he had been the one who suffered the most. Even he thought himself pitiful. He Changdi stood with his back ramrod straight as he strode quickly down the white jade steps of the palace. His face was ashen. His healthy pink lips were now white and peeling. He would also let out a low cough from time to time. It was clear that he had fallen sick. However, his icy aura and cold demeanor lent a hint of beauty even to his ill pallor. While walking along the path to Xuanwu Gate, he kept his gaze lowered. It wasn't until he reached the gates that he looked up, only to see a familiar carriage stopped right outside the palace gates, with Lai Yue and the estate's guards standing next to it. He Changda's eyes lit up, two sparks of light shining steadfastly in the depths of the darkness. The heart he had encased in ice suddenly melted, as if wrapped in a cocoon of warmth, giving him the urge to sigh from the comfort. Unknowingly, his steps underneath him quickened. Lai Yue seemed to have spotted him from afar. Since Lai Yue couldn't pass through the palace gates at this time, he stood where he was and waved at He Changdi. For He Changdi, it was as if the clouds had parted, letting the sun shine brightly in his heart once again. He didn't mind Lei Yu's silly grin for once, and walked over to his manservant in a rare good mood. Once he stepped out of the palace gates, Lai Yue grinned at him and said, "Third young master, you've finally come out of the palace. Third young madam has been waiting for you for close to 2 hours." The spark in He Changda's eyes was still resplendent. His expression was as cool as ever, like an icy mountain, and his tone was calm as he instructed Lai Yue, "After I board the carriage, tell them to return to the estate." Lai Yue complied with a smile. He Changdi immediately turned and got onto the carriage after that order. There was only Chu Lian left in the carriage now. Wenqing and Wanlan seemed to have guessed that he would sit in the carriage with Chu Lian on the way back, so they had gone out and would be returning on horses instead. Chu Lian was lying on her side on the long bench of the carriage. The bench had been covered in a thick and fluffy fleece carpet. An exquisite coral fleece blanket had been draped over her body. Even in her sleep, her brow was furrowed, showing how badly she slept. He Changdi made it to her side in 2 steps and sat down beside her. He reached out and hugged her tightly, pulling her to sit on his lap with her head resting on his broad shoulders. Chu Lian hadn't been sleeping too deeply, so she was woken by his movements. For some reason, waking up in this position in his embrace and seeing his pale face close up brought a pang of heartache. Tears gathered in Chu Lian's eyes and started falling. Chu Lian returned his embrace with arms around his neck as she wiped at her tears with one hand. She was a little frustrated with herself. What was going on with her mood? Why was she crying for no reason? She had never been a crybaby. He Changda's heart had already been aching for his wife ever since the day he had seen her with tear tracks on her face. Now that she was crying right in front of him, his heart ached even more. He lifted her chin with one hand and bent down to kiss the teardrops off her face. He followed the flow of her tears up to the wet corners of her eyes. "Lianer, don't cry. It's all my fault." He didn't know how to comfort others. All he could do was to repeat those 2 lines. However, the emotion in his voice held a miraculous power that somehow helped to calm Chu Lian down. Under his gentle reassurance, her tears quickly stopped flowing. Chu Lian sniffled pitifully and tightened her hold around He Changda's neck, pressing her face into his chest. He Changdi called out gently, "Lianer?" "He Changdi, let me lean on you for a while. I don't want to talk right now." Chu Lian's voice was all muffled, while she was buried in his chest. Thus, He Sanling pressed his lips together and kept his right arm around her waist, while he used his other hand to stroke her soothingly on her back. He looked as if he were comforting a child who was feeling wronged. The carriage started moving slowly. He Changdi didn't speak and simply kissed the top of Chu Lian's head from time to time, enjoying the familiar sensation of his wife in his arms and her enchanting scent. Chu Lian hid in the safety of his chest for a long while before finally lifting up her head and looking at He Changdi. She could tell that he hadn't been very well for the past 2 days. Stubble was growing on his chin, and his lips were peeling. There were also dark eye circles under his eyes now. Chu Lian couldn't resist the urge to kiss him, so she reached up a little and kissed his coarse chin. His stubble was all prickly under her soft lips, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just special. He Changdi started for a bit from Chu Lian's sudden action, and his body froze up for 2 seconds. Slowly after that, life started returning to his eyes, and he met her gaze steadily without blinking. as if he were scared that she would disappear if he blinked. Although the imperial physicians had given her a clean bill of health, Sanlang was still worried for her. Thus, he asked for Great Dr. Miao to look at Chulian the moment they were home. Since they had moved out of the Jinggan estate, Great Dr. Miao had followed them to the Anyuan estate. Chulian had arranged for Great Dr. Miao to have his own courtyard and even a special medicine room. At his age, Great Dr. Miao didn't have much that he was interested in, aside from medicine and good food. With the small and simple family of House Anyuan and Chulian's cooking, the Anyuan estate was the ideal living space for Great Dr. Miao. Thus, Great Dr. Miao was rather grateful to the couple. When Changdi requested his presence, he came quickly. Chulian woke up when she arrived back at Songtao Court. Since the ones serving in Songtao Court were all her close servants, she didn't have anything to be embarrassed about around them. She gave a slight cough to hide the awkwardness remaining on her face. When Uncle Miao comes over later, let him check your pulse. The eternal ice on Changdi's face seemed to have melted away completely. There was a slight smirk on his face, and he simply nodded in reply to her request without any contest. Senior servant Gue had already taken Jingyan and Wanlan with her to the kitchen to cook dinner. Great Dr. Miao was still strong and healthy despite his age, and he arrived at Songtao Court with his medicine box in no time. The moment he entered the parlor, he saw Chulian and Changdi sitting at the head of the room. His first reaction was to give them a glare and admonish them lightly. What did you do to yourselves? Wasn't it supposed to be a simple trip out? Look at what's happened to you both. Others might think that you've gone to battle instead of just hunting. The couple had been around Great Dr. Miao for some time now, so they treated him like a senior member of their family. When Great Dr. Miao reprimanded them like this, all they could do was smile sheepishly back. Great Dr. Miao set his medicine box on the table and sat down with an air of authority. He faced the couple and asked, "Who's first?" Chulian turned to look at Changdi, who took the hint and walked over to Great Dr. Miao's side. Great Dr. Miao took up his hand and remained silent as he read Changdi's pulse. After a short while, he spoke up, "It's nothing major. You caught a cold from the cold weather because your body wasn't in the best condition. You tired yourself out and put stress on your body by worrying too much. Just have a good night's rest and take some medicine and you'll be fine." After saying that, Great Dr. Miao turned his attention to Chulian. "Now, how about you? How did you get yourself into this state? I just got you back to good health, and this is how you repay me?" Chulian lowered her head in shame from the doctor's scolding. Chapter 662. Pregnant, 2. Seeing how worriedly the young couple was looking at him, Great Dr. Miao's expression relaxed. "Did the imperial physician prescribe you any medicine, and did you eat it?" Chulian explained what had happened to her in the arena at the hunting grounds. "Physician Zhou and Li checked on my health, but I didn't drink any medicine. I only had some normal nourishing soup." Hearing that Chulian had fallen off her horse, Great Dr. Miao's eyes widened as far as they could go. However, after hearing that she hadn't taken any medicine, he heaved a sigh of relief. Those sly imperial physicians. The old foxes must have suspected that Chulian was pregnant, but they likely hadn't been able to diagnose it properly, so they must have avoided prescribing any medicine for their own safety. "The two of you are seriously muddle-headed." Great Dr. Miao pointed a shaking finger at the couple in his anger. He turned to look at the servants standing behind Chulian and Changdi and lamented, "Ah, what a useless group of people." Chulian was shocked by Great Dr. Miao's sudden change in mood. What was going on? Faced by all the dazed and confused faces around him, Great Dr. Miao just couldn't keep his temper up. He stopped beating around the bush and stated, "Lianer is already 1 month pregnant. Thank your lucky stars. If you continue being so clumsy, you might have lost the child." "What?" The sudden announcement from Great Dr. Miao made everyone dumbfounded and lost for words. The most exaggerated reaction came from Changdi. He completely lost his usual cool and stiff facade as a myriad of emotions blossomed into life on his face. Chulian was stiff with shock. She looked down dazedly at her flat abdomen. So there was already a new life growing in there without her knowing. She subconsciously reached out to stroke her abdomen. Even if she couldn't feel any change, Chulian still thought that something was different. He Changdi turned to stare at Chulian. There were too many emotions in his eyes to name, but slowly, joy surfaced up and shone in his gaze. He pulled Chulian into his embrace without caring for their audience, hugging Chulian around her narrow waist and stroking Chulian's smooth hair tenderly. He mumbled, "Leaner, we have a child." In his past life, He Changdi had never consummated his marriage with Chulian. Later on, when House Jingon had fallen and he had been exiled, his very survival had been a problem out in the bitter north. With revenge on his mind, he hadn't had the time to consider relationships with women. Thus, this child was his very first. Now that he was going to become a father for the first time, and the person who was going to bear the next generation for him was a woman he deeply loved, the last bits of ice locking his heart fully melted away. The servants, senior servant Zhong and Xiyin included amongst them, finally reacted to the news. Joy shone from all of their faces. Senior servant Zhong's eyes couldn't even be seen from how widely she was beaming. Great Dr. Miao harumphed, "Don't get too happy yet. Tell me, did you hear what I just said?" He Changdi and Chu Lian's hearts thumped in unison. There was extreme worry in He Changdi's expression. "Uncle Miao, how is Lianer's body now?" Chu Lian looked up at Great Dr. Miao with uncertainty on her face. This was her first ever child as well. She wanted to protect her child with all her might. The little sprout was the product of the love between her and He Changdi, a living testament to the depth of their feelings and promise to each other. Great Dr. Miao was pretty helpless in the face of their worry. He could only try to empathize with them, since they were going to be parents for the first time. He explained everything to them in detail patiently. "From what I can tell, the fetus is in a stable condition. However, don't be so rash as you were last time. Lianer's body isn't in the best of health now. Before the pregnancy is stable, stay in the estate and be careful." Great Dr. Miao's words were like an imperial decree, from the way everyone present was listening intently. Before Great Dr. Miao left, he specially called out to He Changdi, "Zixiang, come with me. I have some instructions for you." He Changdi didn't dare to tarry and quickly followed after Great Dr. Miao out of the room. Now it was only Chu Lian and her servants left in the parlor. When she looked up and around the circle of servants, all she could see was happiness and elation on their faces. The corners of her mouth couldn't help lifting in a smile. Senior servant Zhong stood at the lead of the group of maidservants as they bobbed in respect towards Chu Lian in unison. The old servant's eyes were still upturned crescents as she said, "Congratulations, third young madam. Our estate is about to have a new heir." The people in this era tended to favor males more, so Chu Lian didn't correct the senior servant's words. She simply smiled again and told them to stand. When Chu Lian stood up, wanting to return to her bedroom to change, Xiyin immediately rushed over to support her. Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry at her action. She glared at Xiyin. Why did she feel that she had suddenly become someone who couldn't even walk properly in the eyes of her servants? The child in her belly was likely only a fertilized egg at this point. "Shu, I can walk by myself. You're making a mountain out of a molehill." Xiyin wasn't willing to budge and insisted on holding her, so Chu Lian let her be. Once they entered the bedroom, just as she was about to lie down on the chaise by the bed, senior servant Zhong ordered all the maidservants in the room to leave. Chu Lian found it strange. She gaped a little at senior servant Zhong's sudden actions. "Momo, what is it? Do you have something to say to me in private?" Senior servant Zhong had some knowledge of medicine and midwifery. While she had been away at the rural holdings of House Jingon, she had helped quite a few pregnant women deliver their children. She was a very capable person. He Changdi respected her, so Chu Lian also viewed her as half a senior family member. Senior servant Zhong walked over to Chu Lian and sat down in front of her. She took Chu Lian's hand in her own and smiled. "Third young madam, this old servant will ask someone to clear out the side room and move third young master's daily necessities over." He Changdi paused before shaking his head slightly. Keep it a secret from the old residents too. Well, wait until Leander hits 2 months and her pregnancy is stable. Then I'll take Leander personally to the old residents to announce the good news. Senior servant Zhong was thinking of persuading him otherwise, but when she thought back to Great Dr. Miao's diagnosis, she swallowed her words back down. Great Dr. Miao had said that they had almost lost the child in Chu Lian's belly. If anything happened, and they told the old residents too early, wouldn't it just turn out to be false hope? The senior family members in the old residence might even blame third young master and madam for it. Waiting until the pregnancy was stable before announcing it would be the best course of action. Senior servant nodded upon understanding the circumstances. She bobbed once again towards Chu Lian and He Changdi, before quietly retreating out of the room to manage the other maidservants. Once senior servant Zhong left, He Changdi strode over to Chu Lian's side. He reached out with his powerful arms and slid them under her knees and back. He lifted her from the chaise in a princess carry, then settled onto the chaise with her on top. He Changdi placed one hand on Chu Lian's shoulders, while the other was placed gently on her belly. His tone was filled with a soft warmth. Leander, we're going to have a child. Chu Lian was equally happy. She had been waiting for this little being's arrival for a few months. Hubby, would you like a boy or a girl? Chu Lian raised her head to stare into He Changdi's soft gaze. He Changdi bent his body over slightly to place a kiss on her smooth forehead. A daughter. It would be best if she looks like you. She'll definitely be very cute. Chu Lian puffed up her cheeks and glared at him. You're just saying that to make me happy, right? Eldest brother only has little N and little Lin, and second brother hasn't gotten married yet. It's not just grandmother, but even father and mother are probably waiting for me to give birth to a boy. He Changdi stiffened up. He hadn't expected Chu Lian to respond this way. He thought back to what Great Dr. Miao had told him in private. The doctor had mentioned that pregnant women were more susceptible to changes in mood as well as emotions, and that he had to be more understanding and forgiving of his wife. His brows relaxed, and he stroked Chu Lian's silky hair with one hand. Actually, He Changdi had truly been speaking his mind. He did want a daughter for his first child. When he thought of having a mini Chu Lian running around, his heart immediately melted into a puddle of mush. Whether it's a boy or a girl, they'll be our child. They'll treat them the same. If the future little bun were to find out what his father had said today, he would definitely burst into tears and question his father. A satisfied smile surfaced on Chu Lian's face after getting He Changdi's answer. She was a modern person at heart, and she didn't favor any gender in particular. No matter which gender their child belonged to, she would still guide and protect them the same. Furthermore, it wasn't up to her whether she gave birth to a boy or a girl. If it didn't turn out to be a boy, then it was He Changdi's problem. Chu Lian gulped audibly. She slapped his chest. What the hell were you thinking? How could you dare to do such a thing? You're lucky His Majesty didn't blame you for it. He Changdi harumphed inwardly. Even if they didn't do it, there would have been someone else who did. It was Xiao Bojian who had used that private silver mine to get to where he did in his previous lifetime. The silver mine was in the north, not too far from the mountain where Chu Lian had fallen. It was the Tuhan spies who first found it. Although he had known of this vaguely in his past, he hadn't had the details of its location, nor had he known that this had something to do with the Tuhans. It wasn't until this lifetime that he had gone to investigate further and gotten all the details. That was when he had found out that the Tuhans wanted to steal the silver mine for themselves. Xiao Bojian had likely been in cahoots with the Tuhans even in his past life. It was also there was Tuhan interference that he and Prince Jean hadn't suffered any consequences on the surface even after this matter had been reported to the Emperor. To the rest of the world, they had cleared out all the Tuhan spies and secured the silver mine for their empire. However, it was a different matter altogether in private. The Emperor's opinion of them had likely sunk to the lowest. How could the Emperor not lay blame on them? Just from the spring hunt alone, they could see that the Emperor had purposely suppressed Prince Jean from shining too much and had intentionally shown favor to 6th Prince instead. 6th Prince was only 15 this year. Yet the emperor had actually given him permission to join in court. Those with discerning eyes could tell that the crown prince had been locked up and was only an empty shell. The ones who had the ability to fight for the throne were fourth prince and sixth prince. However, back when they had discovered the silver mine, the only ones with them had been their trusted subordinates. They had even placed a group of loyal assassins sworn to the death there. Going by common sense, the existence of the silver mine should never have leaked out. How had this news somehow made it up to the emperor too? He had been investigating along with fourth prince's men these few days, but none of the subordinates seemed suspicious. He had known of the silver mine thanks to his previous memories. Then, could there be someone else who was the same as him? Changda's pupils dilated as a dangerous light shone from them. Each suspicious incident seemed to be connected by an invisible line. Meeting Xiaobojian and Suzhou, Chu Lian getting kidnapped, the messy things that had happened when they had returned to the Jinggan estate, Chu Lian almost getting trapped at Miss Yuan's coming of age. There had been so many strange events that had never happened in his previous life. Adding on to that the secret of the silver mine leaking, unless there was really someone else who had experienced the same lifetime he had. Changdi suppressed his turbulent emotions and took in a deep breath, shoving all his terrifying guesses to the bottom of his heart. What's done is done. We can't cry over spilled milk. Sanlang's voice was cold and calm. Chu Lian sighed. That was true. Things had already come to this point. She didn't think that Changdi and Prince Jean developing a mine on their own was that major of a crime. Even if they hadn't done it, someone else would have. If the silver mine had landed in the hands of someone sinister, then the situation might be even more dangerous. This was a selfish world. While there weren't any obvious factions in the war for the throne, since Changdi was close to Prince Jean, and if Prince Jean wanted to vie for the throne, Sanlang had no choice but to be dragged into Prince Jean's faction. Chapter 665. Bestowal of an Engagement, 1. It seemed like he had to be more careful in the future. Chu Lian hesitated before asking. So the accessories and storefront you gifted me previously were all bought with the money from the silver mines? A corner of Changda's lips lifted. He reached out to hold her more securely so that her body wouldn't lean over and touch the cold windowsill. Just by seeing that smile of his, Chu Lian knew that she had guessed correctly. She admonished him. You really just used it without any shame. If you look at it more strictly, you committed graft. Changda's deep gaze fell upon the flushed cheeks of the woman he loved in his arms. He sighed inwardly. Although his wife was smart and cunning, she was too inexperienced and merciful. If she really met someone with no holds barred when it came to scheming, she would definitely fall into their traps. Rest assured, the silver I spent was barely the tip of the iceberg compared to the size of that silver mine. The government has its own laws. Even if it was His Highness and I who discovered that silver mine, there are some laws we can't circumvent selfishly. Lianer, don't worry. I've only taken what I deserved. Chu Lian was a little confused by Changda's answer, but she didn't continue questioning. She didn't understand the twists and turns of the politics in court, so she wouldn't comment thoughtlessly. However, she now knew that her lunatic husband wasn't a stickler for the rules. Instead, he was even more cunning than a fox. Chu Lian laid back down on Changda's firm chest. She twirled a single lock of his long, black hair in one hand, continuously winding his hair around her finger. I know that Imperial Concubine Wei found out. So you really went to pick herbs for Imperial Princess Liao that night? Chu Lian glared at him, thinking that her husband was just too honest. Why had he so obediently gone to do Imperial Concubine Wei's bidding? Even if she had blackmail on him, couldn't he have been a little smarter about it? No, Changdi replied in a calm voice. Chu Lian, I didn't go out to pick herbs for Imperial Princess Liao. In actual fact, the Imperial physicians weren't lacking for supplies. All she was trying to do was to make life difficult for me. I simply went out to the forest and knocked out the attendants that she had sent to follow me. All I did was wait in the mountains until midnight before turning to the camp. Changdi had only done all that for show. Although he wasn't afraid of Imperial Concubine Wei's threats, he was still an official and someone that the Emperor had personally administered. As much as imperial concubine Wei tried to throw her weight around, she couldn't interfere with the workings of the court, so she wouldn't be able to affect him much. However, it was different for Chu Lian. Even if imperial concubine Wei wouldn't touch him, she could use her identity to pressure Chu Lian. Pregnant women where He Changdi looked down at the woman in his embrace. He carefully shifted his left arm so that she would move into a more comfortable pose against his shoulder. He pulled over a nearby wool blanket and laid it over Chu Lian's slender little figure. Chu Lian seemed to have been startled by his action, even in the midst of sleep. A wrinkle developed between her brows as they drew together. He Changdi bent over and placed a light kiss on her forehead, like the touch of a feather, causing her brow to relax. Chapter 666, Bestowal of an Engagement 2. While the Anyuan estate was wrapped up in warmth, deep within the palace, Qingjing Hall was vastly empty and cold in comparison. A few old members of the cabinet were gathered there. All of them had their heads bowed, and none of them were speaking. The hall was currently enshrouded in a creepy silence. Seated behind the imperial desk, the emperor's face was flushed red from the force of his rage. He pushed over a stack of reports, letting the scrolls spill over to the ground. Well, what capable officials we have here. Fine. Even if you don't tell us today, we will find out eventually. Scram. As the echoes of the emperor's last word faded in the cavernous hall, the esteemed cabinet members bowed deeply and quickly retreated out of the hall. The emperor's chest heaved as he panted for breath. It was only when there was no one else left in the hall that Eunuch Wei dared to speak up softly. Your Majesty, please don't be angry. If your Majesty is still brooding over the events of that year, then your Majesty's health is of the utmost importance. As long as your Majesty remains healthy, those old foxes won't be able to have you in the palm of their hands. Although Eunuch Weiss words towed the line between them as master and servant, they were rather effective on the emperor. As expected, the emperor's breathing slowly calmed down after a moment. Summon He Lin. Eunuch Wei heaved a sigh of relief and hurriedly rushed off to execute the order. In less than 15 minutes, He Lin was already standing in front of the emperor in Qingjing Hall. The emperor's eyes were half-lidded, his entire body clad in a ruler's fearsome aura. It made him hard to read. Even He Lin felt a little scared of the emperor at this moment. How is the task we entrusted to you? He Lin quickly pulled out a small scroll from his pouch and offered it up to the emperor with both hands. The emperor took it and immediately opened it to read. Although it was a small scroll, it had been made exquisitely. The words written within were only half the size of a rice grain. While the scroll wasn't very long, thanks to the small writing, it had a lot of content. If Chu Lian had been present, she would surely have cried out in alarm. The scroll recorded every detail of what Chu Lian had done while growing up in the Ying estate. From her favorite childhood snacks, to how she had been bullied terribly by her sisters in House Ying when she had grown older. The emperor had started out with an air of anticipation. However, when he started reading the contents, his brows had furrowed together tighter and tighter until he could no longer control himself and ended up crushing the scroll. He had never expected that his and Asun's child would have grown up in such a manner. His daughter should have been born with a silver spoon. She should have been clothed in the finest fabrics, served by a crowd of servants, tutored by the best teachers, and following that, under his protection, she should have transformed into the most dazzling and eye-catching pearl. However, reality had been completely different. When Chu Lian had been young, going by what this scroll said, she likely wouldn't have had more than 1 or 2 little snacks, let alone the bare necessities. Eunuch Wei trembled upon catching sight of the emperor's expression. The emperor had survived the war against his siblings to claim the throne. Even if he had a kind enough appearance, his inner heart was actually cold and ruthless, with countless schemes and plots brewing. Eunuch Wei had been serving him for so many decades that he could somewhat guess a little at the emperor's moods, even if his true thoughts were hidden. Every time the emperor showed an expression like that, it meant that misfortune was about to befall some poor soul. Eunuch Weiss' prediction was rather accurate. The emperor forcefully shut the scroll in his hands. He turned towards Eunuch Wei, who was standing in a stiff position behind him. Prepare the ink. There was a blank imperial decree scroll laid out on the desk. In a short moment, the blank scroll was completely filled up. The emperor tossed the finished imperial decree over to Eunuch Wei casually. He left behind an order. Send someone to the Ing estate to announce the decree. Eunuch Wei's hands trembled. When he recalled the glimpses of the decree that he had seen, a chill went up his spine. After finishing all this, the emperor gave another order. Lin, go over to Yang Yinfeng and have him think of a way to remove Chu Qizheng's position. Lin froze up for an instant, but he didn't dare to refute the order. He made a cupped fist salute and left to do as the emperor had ordered. Chu Qizheng had originally been given a low-ranked slack position in the court. Later on, he had somehow gotten connected with the Pan estate, and Lord Pan had personally recommended him for a promotion. From then, Chu Qizheng had become a proper 6th-ranked official. It was also due to this official position that Chu Qizheng had suddenly become one of the more promising men in the younger generation of House Ing. He had also stabilized the status of the second branch in the Ing estate. Even old Duchess Ing had stopped mentioning the lack of heirs for the second branch due to this. The next day, an astonishing piece of news spread throughout the whole capital. The emperor had personally bestowed an engagement upon House Ying's 8th miss, Chu Yuan. The groom in question was Prince Yongkang's only son, Royal Prince Shou. Speaking of which, Prince Yongkang was actually the emperor's uncle, and the emperor had been the one who had conferred the title of Royal Prince Shou upon his son. Royal Prince Shou was already 23 this year. At that age, it was just right for him to take his first wife. Furthermore, Royal Prince Shou was considered part of the imperial family. While it seemed to be a good pairing on the surface, those in the know were all waiting to watch the fireworks and were laughing behind the backs of the second branch of House Ing. The reason was none other than this. Royal Prince Shou was a half-wit. He was a robust and prosperous person who always had a foolish expression on his face. Prince Yongkang had married his older cousin, Royal Princess Longjia. Royal Prince Shou was the masterpiece of this marriage between close relations. Chapter 667. Heartless. 1. House Ing had not completely fallen out of noble society up till now purely because of the strenuous efforts of old Duke Ing. It was a sad story. Although House Ing was large in number, there weren't many who were actually capable. Even Chu Lian's father Chu Qizheng was considered one of the better ones in the family, so the abilities of the rest went without saying. Meanwhile, old Duchess Ing was full of wariness and vigilance. She wasn't willing to use funds to prop up other branches of the family that had more potential. This made the rest of their clan very unhappy with House Ing. This caused a vicious cycle within the family. Finally, when a rare promising young seed had popped up from amongst old Duke Ying's disciples, they hadn't been able to catch hold of Xiao Bojian either. Now it was too late, even if old Duke Ying tried to force Xiao Bojian into the family himself. When the emperor's imperial decree reached the Ying estate, none of the members of House Ing felt sad or shocked. Conversely, they were all extremely elated. A bestowed marriage. Furthermore, it was the emperor himself who had personally decreed it. The groom was even a royal prince, a true member of the imperial family. Although there seemed to be something wrong with his mind, it wouldn't affect his standing due to his birth. As long as Miss Yuan married him, she would become a third-ranked royal princess by marriage. That was an honor that most of the Chu family ladies wouldn't even be able to beg for. Even Chu Lian's own marriage couldn't compare to that honor. Everyone in the Ing estate was beaming with joy. Even the stewards started ordering the servants to decorate the estate and make it seem more festive and harmonious. Even old Duchess Ing was chuckling. She praised Miss Yuan for being lucky in front of all the other ladies of the estate. The second branch was even looked upon more favorably due to this engagement. The only ones who had faces full of worry and despair were likely Second Madam and 8th Miss Yuan now. Chu Yuan was sprawled across Second Madam's lap. She had already cried until she was all out of breath. She sobbed, "Mother, I don't want to marry that idiot. Mother, I'm not going to marry him. Please, help me think of a way out. The one I like is Brother Xiao." Second Madam's eyes were red and swollen. Miss Yuan was her only daughter, her very lifeline. The others in the estate had been blinded by riches and status. None of them were truly concerned for her daughter's plight. Other than his birthright, there was nothing about Royal Prince Shou that could compare to even the most common man. How could she just watch as her daughter's life was ruined? She stroked her daughter's messy hair. Yuan, don't panic. When your father returns, Mother will ask your father to intervene. Your father has an official position, and he has many connections. Even that Lord Pan has some relation to him. Mother will definitely get your father to think of a way so you won't have to marry that half-wit. Right as mother and daughter were huddling together and crying, Chu Qijing returned to the second branch's courtyard. His entire being seemed dull and lifeless. He had lost his high spirits and his eyes seemed soulless. Hidden in his sleeves, he was still gripping that official document that had caused his days. His face seemed to have aged a decade since morning. The menial maidservant who was sweeping the courtyard came over to greet him with a smile. She even tried to get a bonus by congratulating him. This servant congratulates Second Master, Second Madam, and Eighth Miss on the good news. Chu Qizheng's face immediately contorted into a monstrous expression, veins popping out on his forehead. Scram! The maidservant stood frozen on the spot for a moment. When she finally processed what happened, her face paled and she scrambled away in fright. Chu Qijing returned to his room, cloaked in anger. Another maidservant greeted him at the entrance, but Chu Qijing didn't even say a word in return. He simply strode right into the room. Within the bedroom, Second Madam was still comforting Miss Yuan with a hug. When Second Madam saw that her husband had returned, she immediately patted her daughter on the back and stood up to welcome her husband back. She started off with a complaint. Dear, you have to help Yuan, otherwise her entire life will be ruined. The rumors about the foolish royal prince Shou had already spread all over the capital. What kind of life could a lady expect by marrying a fool? It wasn't even guaranteed that they might be able to have children. Second Madam had been completely shocked out of her wits by her daughter's sudden engagement. Adding on to that her own urgency, she hadn't noticed the stormy expression on Chu Qizheng's face when he entered. Chu Qijing was already immersed in his own troubles. His wife's complaint only added on to the mountain of frustration in his heart and acted as the spark that lit up his rage. In a burst of temper, he shoved his wife aside forcefully. Although he hadn't learned martial arts, he was still a tall man and he had put enough force into his action. With a single move, he actually managed to push Second Madam off her feet and onto the floor. Second Madam hadn't expected such a violent reply from Chu Qijing. She laid sprawled over the carpet in the bedroom where she had landed, eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at Chu Qijing. She clearly hadn't recovered from the physical and mental blow. What's wrong with becoming a royal princess? If not for the imperial decree, could Miss Yuan even hope to marry into a prince's family? Chu Qizheng's voice was both cold and heartless. His words pierced like needles into the hearts of Second Madam and Chu Yuan. Both mother and daughter had their eyes wide in shock, especially Chu Yuan. Chapter 668, Heartless 2. Get out of here. Miss Yuan, go back to your room and prepare for your marriage. If you dare to plot anything else, I'll destroy you myself. Chu Yuan collapsed onto the chaise, her eyes bloodshot from her own rage. Father, I'll never marry that idiot, even if I have to die. That's not up to you. Servants, send your young miss back to her room. If anything happens to Eighth Miss, all of you had better prepare for death. Chu Qijing was especially ferocious today. Even Second Madam had been scared into trembling, let alone the servants at the side. Miss Yuan screamed and struggled, to no avail. Two strong menial servants stuffed a handkerchief in her mouth and tied up her limbs, and she was quickly carted away. It wasn't until Chu Yuan's muffled shouts could no longer be heard that Second Madam seemed to rouse herself, as if awakening from a dream. She was helped off the floor by a maidservant. She walked over to Chu Qijing and stared up at him. Chu Qijing, Yuan is our only daughter. How could you treat her this way? Is your official position more important than your own flesh and blood? Chu Qijing let out a mocking snort. He threw the letter in his hands onto Second Madam's face. Position? Is this the official position you're talking about? Second Madam didn't understand. She bore with the humiliation and picked up the letter from the ground. She opened it and read it, only to be hit by a bolt from the blue. It wasn't just a letter. It was an official document of dismissal. The second branch had lost everything today. Second Madam had already reached her limits today. Her eyes rolled back into her head as she slipped into a dead faint. Luckily, the maidservant next to her reacted fast enough to catch her. Otherwise, she would have hit her head on the floor. Thus, when Second Madam woke up again, she never said a word about rejecting her daughter's engagement. All that the impoverished second branch could count on was Chu Yuan's marriage now. Sometimes, when faced with a cruel reality, one just had to make some sacrifices. Right now, it had become time for Miss Yuan to make the sacrifice. Chu Qijing still didn't understand why he had suddenly been fired out of the blue. The couple of the second branch sat on two sides of the chaise with gloomy faces. Chu Qijing suddenly asked, "How much is left of Madame Yes money?" Second Madam was startled by his abrupt question. She waved her trusted handmaid over and told her to retrieve the account books. After reading them over, she said, "Excluding storefronts and farms, there's still 5,000 taels in cash. Give it all to me." Second Madam gaped in surprise. All of it? That was 5,000 taels they were talking about. It wasn't a small sum. Chu Qizhang's heavy gaze swept over Second Madam. She quickly sprang up and went to retrieve an exquisite peachwood chest. She took out 2 silver keys from her purse and opened the chest, before pulling out a whole stack of banknotes from within and passing it to Chu Qijing. Second Madam kept staring at the thick stack of notes with heartache. Chu Qijing sneered. "What are you looking at? These never belonged to you in the first place." Second Madam stiffened up from his words and shifted her gaze away, hands clenched into fists on her lap. "Stay here and make sure you keep a watch on Miss Yuan. If I don't succeed on my mission, then Miss Yuan's only fate is to become a royal princess. Otherwise, well, and just like my 5th brother." Housing had many legitimate children and even more illegitimate ones. Although Chu Qizhang's 5th brother was a legitimate son, his personality had been more naive. He hadn't been much in favor with his parents, and he had married a wife with an unassuming background, so the other branches of the family had stabbed him in the back one day. When Second Madam heard her husband mention 5th brother, her hands shook and she agreed. Chu Qijing gripped the stack of banknotes in his hand tightly and chuckled grimly in his heart. At least that Yi Sun was still of use even now. Actually, the reason the second branch had been able to live so well hadn't been due to old Duchess Ying's care. Instead, it was all thanks to the riches that Yi Sun had left behind. Back then, Yi Sun had left this inheritance to someone she trusted, thinking to pass it down for Chu Lian. Unfortunately, Chu Qijing had found out about the inheritance. He had schemed to pick off all of Yi Sun's trusted subordinates and taken the treasure for himself. If not for fear of someone in the shadows still looking over Chu Lian, he would likely have offed Chu Lian together with them as well. Chu Yuan was being watched over in her room. By now, her tears had already dried up, leaving behind only a deep hatred. The corners of her mouth curved up into a self-deprecating smile. Heh, didn't everyone in the estate want her to marry that royal prince and become a royal princess? Well, she wasn't going to let them have their way. If they didn't care whether she lived or not, then why should she care about their survival? Chu Lian quickly found out about the engagement that the emperor had bestowed upon Miss Yuan. This action made her even more befuddled. Was court getting boring lately? Was the emperor too free? Why did he have the time to think about bestowing a marriage upon a lady of House Ing? While she couldn't say that there were more than 10 ladies of marriageable age in House Ing, there had to be at least 5 or 6 of them. Even if the emperor felt like bestowing a marriage, he could have gone by seniority instead. There was still Miss Su looking for a partner before Miss Yuan. Furthermore, he had betrothed Miss Yuan to Royal Prince Shou. Chu Lian was close to Princess Wei, so she knew a little more about the imperial family. Royal Prince Shou had been born with cerebral palsy, so his thoughts were about the same level as a 3-year-old child. Furthermore, he had a violent temper. Quite a few of the maidservants in his courtyard had already passed away. If Miss Yuan were really to marry him, her own safety couldn't be guaranteed. Was this really the emperor showing favor to House Ying, and not trying to send her half-sister to death? Well, since the emperor had bestowed this marriage as her older sister, she had to send a gift of some sort to the Ying estate. Chapter 669. Dejufeng Restaurant 1. Chu Lian wasn't the only one who was stunned by the sudden decree from the emperor. He Changdi was incredibly surprised as well. At this moment, He Changdi was seated in Prince Jin's study. The two stared at each other in bewilderment. They just couldn't understand the emperor's intentions. Could it be that the emperor wanted to raise Housing up again? That wouldn't be right. A mere bestowal didn't mean anything. Besides, Housing didn't even have any children with talent. Earlier, there had even been a rumor that Chu Lian's father, House Ying's second master, had been dismissed from office. Prince Jin's azure eyes were filled with doubt. Could it be that his extremely wise father was just having fun causing drama? Perhaps he was simply toying with House Ying's second branch for amusement, giving them a slap and then handing out some candy? But these candies weren't even sweet. Even the reincarnated He Changdi couldn't figure out why the emperor had done this. After a period of silence, Prince Jin finally spoke. Adi, our earnings aren't enough to cover our expenses anymore. They now had assistance from House Sima, but they still had to increase their forces, and they had to compete with 6th Prince in secret. There were too many avenues where funds were needed, so Prince Jin and He Changdi couldn't even manage to break even. Actually, it was easy for them to acquire funds publicly. With their statuses, there would definitely be rich people who would lend a helping hand. However, the situation right now was peculiar. Everything had to be done in secret, and for some matters, it was also better for fewer people to be in the know. He Changdi's cool face became increasingly grim. They'll find a solution. He Changdi's eyes deepened. Going by his original plan, it should have been smooth sailing once they secured the silver mine, but there was unexpectedly a slip-up with acquiring the mine. I will send more people to investigate. As he spoke, Prince Jin handed a letter over to He Changdi. The Heiyu army sent this. It was no big deal for him to read Prince Jin's letters, so He Changdi quickly opened the letter and read its contents. What he saw put a slight smile on his face. Xiao Wujing is truly unscrupulous. He even managed to put a person like Wei Fengzi under his control. Adi, I think we should warn father about this. I'm afraid Xiao Bojian is plotting something. Prince Jin was slightly worried. Wei Fengzi was imperial concubine Wei's younger sister. They had been born from the same mother, and she was Minister Kong's wife. This was something that they had to think through carefully. He Changdi looked out of the window as the skies slowly darkened. It was getting late. It's late now. I have to go home. With that said, He Changdi had already stood up and was walking towards the exit. Prince Jin scoffed and sourly replied, Look at how smug you've gotten since Jeannie got pregnant. You've probably been staying by her side 24 hours a day, right? Even if you don't mind, Jeannie would be annoyed. He Sanlang's normally frozen face had changed to something more gentle. There was a warm smile on his face. He hadn't hid the news of Chu Lian's pregnancy from his best friend. What? Are you jealous, Ai? Just get General Sima to make a child for you then. After getting teased right back by his friend, the aloof and proud Prince Jin actually blushed. Miss Yuan and Royal Prince Shou's wedding was to be held in 2 months. After the marriage had been bestowed by imperial decree, Housing started talks with Prince Yongkong over the details of the marriage. After the initial buzz of gossip, it was as if the whole capital had gone into absolute silence. In the following month, everything went as smooth as silk. Chu Lian's restaurant on Zhuke Avenue had already opened. Chu Lian had thought of the new restaurant's name herself, Dejufeng. Just like the old Gillen restaurant, this place was separated into inner and outer courts. However, there was now an extra floor of private rooms added on the 3rd floor of the building in the front. A small stage had been built to the side of the main hall on the ground floor. Dijufeng had a collaboration with Pear Garden to have their actors come over to perform a show every day at noon and 3 o'clock. As for what the actors would perform, the manager would either set the songs in advance or allow guests who were having their meal there to pay for a song they wanted. This time, there wasn't as much fanfare to Dijufeng's opening as when Gillen Restaurant had opened. On the opening day, all they had done was to light up 2 strings of firecrackers and send gifts to the neighboring shops, and that was it. They were open for business. When they opened in such a subdued manner, everyone around them was wondering how this mysterious Dijufeng restaurant was going to end up. However, moments later, carriage after carriage stopped in front of Dijufeng's entrance, causing the eyes of those who had been secretly paying attention to open wide. Amongst the people who were watching was Dean Restaurant's manager Wang. Manager Wang stood in the private room on the 2nd floor of his restaurant, with the old bookkeeper who had worked with him for many years by his side. Manager Wang had his hands clasped behind his back as he squinted past the half-open window. Just who was backing Dijufeng? I've long heard that old Lin's store was bought over by a noble, but when I asked him, the old fogey refused to reveal their identity. The bookkeeper's gaze landed on Dijufeng's entrance. The newly opened restaurant didn't look any different from before. It seemed like all that changed was its signboard and nothing else. Chapter 670. Dijufeng Restaurant 2. Thanks to the trend Gillen Restaurant had set on its opening day, any new shop with a noble backer and some money would at least put on a lion dance performance to liven things up. If they attracted the attention of the civilians around, the name of the shop would be spread around by word of mouth. However, Dijufeng was different. They hadn't even bothered sounding a gong or beating a drum for their opening. Instead, they were ridiculously low profile. Manager Wang had experienced many ups and downs at his old age, so this put him deep in thought. Such an abnormality is a sign that something is amiss. Old Zhao, your eyesight is better than mine. Can you make out which families those carriages are from? Actually, Manager Wang had just been asking rather casually. Although his eyes were old and his vision was blurry, he was still able to make out the shape of the carriages. Those were just ordinary green carriages. There wouldn't be anyone of high status in those, so he was just asking offhand. The old bookkeeper was probably thinking that way as well, but when he saw a particular person being helped off the carriage, he was so shocked that he nearly fainted. He quickly gripped the table beside him with his other hand covering his chest. He had an expression of excitement, yet of dread. Manager Wang was startled by his sudden movement and quickly helped him up. With creased brows, he asked, "Old Zhao, what's going on with you? Weren't you completely fine a moment ago? Why do you have such an ugly expression on your face?" The bookkeeper waved his hand. Bookkeeper Zhao was expert at his work, but he had another skill, which was a photographic memory. He was practically able to remember the faces of anybody that he had met once. Once, when he had been walking out of Dean Restaurant's accounts room, he happened to overhear the Emperor having a conversation within a private room. He had been so frightened by it that he ran off immediately. Later on, curiosity got the better of him as he peeked at the reigning Emperor's face from afar. With that one glance, the face of the Emperor remained in his memory up till now. Dean Restaurant's dim sum was considered top-notch in the capital, so it wasn't strange for the Emperor to come down to have a taste incognito. Once he caught his breath, he looked at Manager Wang while appearing choked up but smiling. Moments later, he whispered into Manager Wang's ear, "Manager, the one who just alighted the carriage was..." The old bookkeeper first pointed at the skies with his forefinger, then raised his thumb. He nervously gulped down his saliva. Manager Wang froze up in shock, then widened his eyes in uncertainty. He gripped the bookkeeper's shoulder and asked, "Are you sure that you didn't make a mistake?" The old bookkeeper shook his head with a bitter smile. "Manager, you know my ability very well. When have I ever made a mistake in identifying someone?" Hearing the certainty in the old bookkeeper's voice, the 2 old men shrank back and were even more in awe of Dijufeng now. That's right. On the opening day of Dijufeng, the Emperor himself had secretly come to support them. As Chu Lian was still confined in the estate due to her pregnancy, she didn't learn of this on the day itself, but He Changdi did inform her of this later on. She didn't know how to react. The emperor had given her too much of an honor. The emperor had personally gone to support the restaurant that she secretly opened. Since the ultimate boss had already gone, the other officials of the court would also go down to the restaurant, even if it were just to flatter the emperor. Therefore, there was no need to fear that there would be a lack of customers. The emperor was practically a living signboard. Besides, Di Jufing's food could only be better and never worse than Gillen Restaurant before its closure. Anyone who had eaten at Gillen Restaurant before would definitely realize what was going on. There was simply no need to guess who the actual boss of Di Jufing was, as it was definitely Martianus on it. Chu Lian left Di Jufing in the care of Zhou Wan, who had come recommended by He Changdi, while the Northern Borders Market was left to manager Qin. The Northern Market had already expanded to over 10 times its original size according to Myrian and his brother, who had come back from the Northern Border. Even Chu Lian found this hard to believe. Myrian and Narasong were now incredibly fluent in Mandarin. If one heard their voice without seeing their faces, they definitely wouldn't be able to guess that they were barbarians. Myrian and Narasong now worked under manager Qin, and were responsible for supervising the Northern Market. Currently, Liangzhou was no longer just a place for the Great Wu Dynasty and the barbarians to trade. It had become a place that attracted merchants from the surrounding countries. This meant that there was now a new trade route between Su City and Liangzhou that came out of nowhere. Liangzhou City was no longer the desolate city that Chu Lian had left 4 months ago. While it was still a simple and crude border city in appearance, the amount of traffic and business it was getting could be compared to Su City's. Originally, Yuri Han had wanted to stay by Chu Lian's side, but Chu Lian hadn't agreed. She knew that Yuri Han loved her sons very much, and that she wouldn't actually want to leave her sons at all. Therefore, she had Yuri Han stay with her sons, and had her take care of their everyday needs. In the beginning of June, summer arrived in the capital. Myrian and his younger brother Narasong once again came to the capital from Liangzhou. There were numerous matters regarding the business that the two needed to report to Chu Lian. The scrawny and weak brothers that Chu Lian had met a long time ago now looked completely different, especially Myrian. The bone structure of the barbarians was different from the people of the Great Wu. Their features were more pronounced than the people of the Great Wu. They had higher nose bridges, deeper eye sockets, and sharper angles overall. The colors of their eyes were also slightly different. If one looked closely, they would find that their eyes were light brown, unlike the amber and brown-colored eyes that the citizens of the Great Wu Dynasty had. After eating well for a few months and learning martial arts training from He Changda's personal guards, as well as getting a good education from manager Qin, 19-year-old Myrian had broken free from the constant torment of his illness, and had grown into a full-fledged, handsome, and well-built young man. Chapter 671. Enjoying the Breeze, 1. He followed behind manager Qin and entered from the side entrance of the estate. As they passed the first wall behind the entrance, then the outer court and finally, to the inner court, there were maidservants peeking at them the whole way. Once they entered the main courtyard within the inner court, manager Qin took Myrian straight to Chu Lian, who was sitting under some grapevines. Today, it was Xian and Wanlan who were on duty. The child and Chu Lian's child had just passed 3 months. Great Dr. Miao had declared that the pregnancy was stable now, making everyone around He Changdi and Chu Lian relax. It was now more than a month since Chu Lian had discovered her pregnancy. She had been trapped in the estate for this whole month. He Changdi was normally very busy, but he somehow managed to free up enough time and spent 2 or 3 days with her in the estate for every 10 days. If it were only senior servants Gue and Zhong by her side, they might not have dared to interfere with her actions, but it was a different story when it came to He Changdi. Thinking back to the month or so that she had been cooped up inside the estate, a furrow developed between Chu Lian's brows. Unless it was absolutely necessary, He Changdi had actually forbidden her from leaving her room. However, she did care very much for the little bun growing in her belly too. So even without any servants by her side to remind her, she would take special care in moving around. Yesterday, Great Dr. Miao had personally declared that she could leave her room. So today, she had come out to enjoy some fresh air under the hanging grapevines. On this hot day, It was already painful enough that she couldn't drink anything cold, but she still had to place a light blanket over her tummy. Chu Lian shifted the thin blanket aside in disdain, but the sharp-eyed Xian quickly pulled it back in place. Chu Lian had no choice but to take up the lotus seed porridge at the side and sip some to alleviate the heat she was feeling. From far away, they could see Manager Qin bringing a few people over. When Chu Lian noticed the foreign-looking man behind Manager Qin, who was at least half a head taller than the poor manager, the corners of her mouth curled up. She had to say that Myrian was rather handsome after he had grown up. He looked like one of those European models from the modern times now. After training with Manager Qin for a few months, he had lost the cowardly and weak demeanor he had when they had first met, and had become more confident. Now that his health had recovered, Myrian was more self-assured. Furthermore, after helping Chu Lian manage the northern market, he had gotten better at speaking. He saw Chu Lian lying against the wooden chair first, and his expression lit up. Following that, he spotted Wanlan, who was sitting beside Chu Lian and working on some embroidery. This time, his brown eyes sparkled even more, as if he had just seen something precious to him. As the men walked closer to them, Chu Lian was observing them. Of course, she noticed Myrian's expression and made a mental note of it. Her eyes slid sideways to cast a nonchalant gaze over Wanlan, who had her head bowed as she focused on her embroidery. A smirk danced on Chu Lian's lips. Manager Qin had come here with Myrian to report on the progress of the northern market, as well as hand over the account books for the season. Knowing that Chu Lian was pregnant now and that she couldn't overexert herself, Manager Qin only stayed for a while before leaving. Just as Manager Qin was leaving, they bumped into He Changdi, who was returning to the estate. He Changdi quickly noticed Myrian standing behind Manager Qin. Myrian came over to greet He Changdi rather enthusiastically, perhaps since they hadn't met for some time. He made a proper salute towards He Changdi, as befitting a citizen of the Great Wu. Brother He Changdi was a little surprised. He hadn't managed to recognize that this tall and skinny foreign boy was Myrian. The Myrian of today was utterly different from the Myrian of his past lifetime. In his past life, Myrian had been so thin that he had been practically skin and bones. He had also been dreadfully ill. He had never seen Myrian look so lively before. Myrian? Myrian grinned and rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. Brother He, I didn't think that you would be able to recognize me. Even Amma said that I've changed too much. He Changdi's gaze was slightly warmer than usual as he patted Myrian's shoulder. How are Amma and your brother? Myrian smiled, revealing a mouthful of white teeth. Amma is doing very well. My brother and I are both working under Manager Qin and learning. He Changdi glanced in the direction the two of them had come from. Did you go to see Madam just now? Manager Qin was the one who replied, replying to my lord. I just handed over the account books for the northern market to Madam, together with Myrian. When He Changdi had left the Jinggan estate, he had brought out all the servants from Songtao court. Since Matriarch He was still around, their rank in their family was still the same, so the servants hadn't changed the way they addressed their masters in the Anyuan estate. They still called the couple third young madam and third young master. However, now that there was a child in Chu Lian's belly, they couldn't continue the old way of addressing their masters, since their masters had upgraded by one generation. If Chu Lian gave birth to a boy, he would become the little heir on Yuan, and He Changdi and Chu Lian would then have to be called master and madam. He Changdi turned to Myrian and said, "They'll go and visit us some other time." He then let Manager Qin and Myrian leave. Chapter 672. Enjoying the breeze, too, He Changdi entered the inner court, only to see that Chu Lian was still sitting under the grape voices and hadn't even moved a little. When he had left the estate at noon, Chu Lian had already been sitting there. It was indeed rather cool under the grapevines here. Since it was close to an alley, a breeze would pass by from time to time, and the dense grapevines absorbed much of the harsh sunlight. It might even be comfier than a modern air-conditioned room. Xian and Wanlan had already asked a few times, but Chu Lian didn't want to move at all. Although it was summer now, it wasn't good for a pregnant woman to sit in the breeze for too long. However, The group of maidservants couldn't get Chu Lian to budge. She had already started flipping through the account books that Manager Qin had just delivered. The moment He Changdi entered the courtyard, he was greeted with the sight of the maidservants standing helplessly next to Chu Lian, looking like they wanted to speak but not daring to at all. When Xian noticed He Changdi, her eyes lit up, as if she had just seen her savior. Chu Lian was currently sitting with her back facing He Changdi, so she couldn't see him at all. He Changdi waved his hand at Xian and Wan Lan to dismiss them. The two handmaids bobbed in respect before leading the other maidservants away. Chu Lian was still marveling at the speedy development of the market and was immersed in the numbers on the pages with wide eyes. All of a sudden, she was pulled up from behind and into someone's embrace, giving her a fright. She only had time to make a short scream before her mouth was devoured by a familiar pair of lips. Her eyes went even wider, and she finally looked right into the dark eyes of her husband. Chu Lian was so angry that she beat on He Changdi's chest. He Changdi let her struggle, but he made sure to keep her stable in his embrace. He kept one hand over her waist to make sure she wouldn't kick her own belly. At the same time, he refused to give in and played with her tongue mercilessly. It only took a few punches before Chu Lian gave up on moving him. His chest was all hard, and it seemed like it didn't even affect him. In the end, all she was doing was making her hands sore. The flurry of movement and the battle between their tongues sapped her strength away, making her boneless. She could only let this lunatic husband of hers do as he liked. When He Changdi finally let go of her tongue, they were already back in their own room. Chu Lian's face was fully flushed. The parts of her neck exposed to the air were also pink. Pregnant women were more sensitive than most. Right now, her eyes were slightly watery, giving her a tender and beguiling aura, seducing the person beholding her beauty. He Changdi's pupils dilated, and he took a gulp. All the blood in his body rushed downwards. He sat Chu Lian down on the chaise, while he took a few steps back to put some distance between them. He tugged at his robes awkwardly. He reprimanded her in a cool voice. "You're not allowed to sit in the breeze for more than 2 hours from now on." Chu Lian simply stared at him, tongue-tied. Was he going to nitpick even over this? He was going to become a busybody soon. There was the hint of a pout in her voice as she replied, "It's hot in the room." He Changdi looked around the room and retrieved a hand fan from the side. He opened it up and started fanning her. "Is it still hot now?" Chu Lian didn't know how to reply to that. A twitch developed in the corner of her mouth, and she tried to push away He Changdi, who was starting to lean closer and closer to her. "Why did you come back so early today?" "I didn't go to the ministry today. I was at Prince Jin's estate, so I came home earlier." He Changdi couldn't resist hugging Chu Lian again. Her figure was already small in the first place. Even though she was now more than 3 months pregnant, she hadn't gotten any bigger yet. Only the smooth glow of her skin and her extra sensitivity hinted that there was a new life growing inside her. His arm slid under her slender neck, and he continued fanning her. The cool breeze washed over her flushed cheeks and neck, carrying the slight fragrance of her body to his nose, immediately tempting the desire he had suppressed for months. The thought of the silver mine that had been taken away by the emperor suddenly came to Chu Lian's mind. A wrinkle appeared between her brows, and she turned to catch He Changdi's collar, looking up at him. She was about to tell him about the northern market when He Changdi bent down to catch her lips once again. He licked her cherry-red lips before nibbling on her full lower lip. Finally, his agile tongue slid into her sweet, warm cavern and immediately overpowered her. Chu Lian gave in to the desire that his actions had stirred. Even if she tried to push him, it had no effect, so she could only wrap her arms around his waist and continuously stroke the area there. For such a tall and strong man, He Changdi's most sensitive area was actually his waist. However, even Chu Lian didn't know that. In the middle of playing with Chu Lian's tongue, He Sanlang suddenly frowned and let out a suppressed moan. Even if it was a man's voice, that moan was very seductive. Before Chu Lian could react, he threw away the fan in his hands and pulled Chu Lian onto his lap. His other hand caught both of Chu Lian's naughty hands and restrained them. Chu Lian quivered a little at the sudden movement, her half-lidded eyes immediately fluttering open. Being held down like this made her shy and timid. She turned her head away because she couldn't meet his eyes in this state. However, there was still a buff arm wrapped around her, so she couldn't get away totally. He Changdi, let go of me. She panted coquettishly in protest. Right now, her entire body was in his arms. How could he Changdi bear to let go of his lovely wife at this point? A man who had been left high and dry for 2 months was to be feared, especially when it was the lunatic He Changdi. He tightened his embrace around Chu Lian and panted into her ear. The hot and heavy breaths puffing over her ears made them flush instantly. Chu Lian could hear his husky voice pleading, like a big puppy begging for help. Lianer, help me, please? Chapter 673, Jingyan, 1. No way. That was what Chu Lian wanted to say, but He Changdi didn't even give her the time to reject his plea. He took her soft little hand and started moving it. After a long time, while waiting for him to finish, Chu Lian was starting to feel that the hand was no longer her own. Chu Lian laid in his embrace, panting, her clothes in disarray. Her belt had already been taken off long ago, and the light yellow halter top that was her underwear had been thrown under the chaise by He Sanlang. Although Sanlang still wasn't completely satisfied, for the sake of his wife's body, he hadn't gone any further than that. Of course, the sounds made by the couple had already been overheard by senior servant Zhong, was on duty outside the room. Just as He Sanlang was about to carry Chu Lian off to the bathroom, senior servant Zhong purposely coughed loudly from outside. Chu Lian made an embarrassed and awkward expression. The flush that had receded from her cheeks came back in full force. She secretly pinched He Changdi's arm, hard. He Changdi bent down to kiss her on her forehead, speaking in a low tone to reassure her, go ahead and take a bath first. I'll go talk to Momo. Chu Lian wasn't opposed to this suggestion. Senior servant Zhong was He Changdi's servant after all. If he wanted to explain, he could do it by himself. She was too embarrassed to face the old servant. He Changdi gently lowered Chu Lian into the bathtub and called Xian over to serve her, before vanishing outside to talk to senior servant Zhong. When senior servant Zhong saw that He Changdi had walked out of the bedroom, she hesitated to speak. He Changdi coolly spoke up before she could gather her courage. Momo, you don't have to worry. I know the limits. Uncle Miao has already informed me of what not to do. Senior servant Zhong showed an awkward smile. It's all right as long as master knows what to do. This old servant shall not overstep her bounds. Once senior servant Zhong was done speaking, He Changdi immediately turned back to the bedroom. Jingyan had been standing behind senior servant Zhong, so she had heard the sounds from the bedroom just the same. She waited until He Changdi had turned his back to them before raising her head. As her gaze landed upon that straight back and slender figure, a mesmerized look appeared on her face. Although He Changdi had always kept an unfriendly and cold expression on his face, his looks were top-notch regardless. He wouldn't lose any of his outstanding aura even if he stood next to Xiao Bojian, especially those dark, deep eyes of his which looked like they could pierce right into the heart of anyone and see through all their secrets. Jingyan continued daydreaming about how the icy facade on He Changdi's face might break during moments of passion. She got so excited that her entire body shivered in anticipation. She knew that He Changdi hadn't gone to bed with Chu Lian for close to 2 months. Just now, in the bedroom, he had likely only done a quick release. As a normal and healthy young man, how could that be enough to satisfy him? Mark Hyun Yuan treated the Marchioness very well. However, how many men were there in this world who could keep their hands to themselves and not stray from their wives? Even if they somehow kept their hearts set on that one person, they still had to work off the excess desire in their bodies somehow. Men and women were different. Furthermore, most nobles had a whole harem of wives and concubines in their inner courts. Even when it came to the prince consorts, none of them truly stayed loyal to their princesses. Jingyan felt as if she had finally found a chance. She had been waiting for so long, but her time had finally come. When she thought back to how Ming Yin had ended up, she felt that Ming Yin had been too stupid. Once she had stabilized her position and status in the household, she would definitely find some time to burn some incense for Mingyan. Since Chu Lian's pregnancy had already passed 3 months, it was about time to announce the news to the old residents. She and He Changdi had a discussion and decided to make a trip to the old residence the next day. He Changdi accompanied Chu Lian for dinner, but right after they were done, there was a messenger from Prince Ji. He Sanling changed out of his home clothes and took Liyue and the guards out with him. It was midnight by the time he returned to the estate. He Changdi was still worried about Chu Lian, so he immediately went to the bedroom to take a look at Chu Lian once he was back. Chu Lian had already fallen asleep. For the past few weeks, Chu Lian had become more and more sleepy. If not for Great Dr. Miao explaining that this was normal behavior for pregnant women, He Changdi would definitely have kidnapped all the physicians in the Imperial Physician Institute over. He Sanlang touched Chu Lian's flushed cheeks before reluctantly pulling apart from her. It was Jing Yan's turn to take the night shift, so He Changdi called her and asked her about Chu Lian's condition. Jing Yan followed behind He Changdi obediently and whispered her reply. Madam was going to wait for Master to return before sleeping, but she started nodding off while reading a book against the headboard. This servant suggested that Madam should sleep first. He Changdi glanced at Jing Yan from the corner of his eyes before ordering, "Take good care of your madam." Jing Yan watched as He Changdi strode off to the study in the outer court. She bit her lip in frustration. However, her eyes turned in thought for a moment, and the corner of her lips curled up in a smirk. Shi Yin and Jing Yan shared a room, so the sound of Jing Yan pouring water woke Shi Yin up. She rubbed her eyes sleepily, still only half awake. She asked in a complaining manner, "What are you doing in the middle of the night? Why aren't you by third young madam's side?" Jing Yan jumped in fright and quickly hid the thin nightgown she had already prepared. Her voice was rather tense as she replied, "Third young madam is asleep. I was all sweaty and I couldn't sleep, so I came back to wipe the sweat first. I'll go right back once I'm done, and it'll be done quick. Don't worry." Xian didn't think too much of it. Jing Yan was normally very quiet and kept her focus on her task. Although she didn't do her tasks very well, it wasn't too bad either. Her work was just average, but Chu Lian had never said anything about it. Xian turned around and continued sleeping, not thinking to bother with Jing Yan. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.